The maternity ward erupted into controlled chaos. "Push, Jasmine. One more push." Monitors beeped frantically. Nurses rushed between machines. A doctor barked instructions over the growing cries filling the delivery room. Jasmine Carter gripped the hospital bed so tightly her knuckles turned white. Another wave of pain crashed through her body. She screamed, not just from the agony of childbirth, but because her eyes were fixed on something far more painful. The chair beside her bed. Empty. Completely empty. Just 15 minutes earlier, the man who had promised to hold her hand through every contraction had quietly picked up his jacket. He looked at her, opened his mouth, as if he wanted to say something, then turned around and walked out of the room. No goodbye, no explanation, no promise to return, only silence. Now, as their son fought to enter the world, Jasmine was fighting a different battle, the unbearable realization that the person she trusted most had chosen to leave when she needed him most. A nurse squeezed her shoulder. "Look at me." Jasmine struggled to focus through tears. "You can do this." Jasmine gasped. "I can't." The nurse smiled gently. "Yes, you can. Because your baby is counting on you." Those words reached somewhere deeper than fear. Jasmine closed her eyes, took one trembling breath, then pushed with everything she had left. At that exact moment, just a few floors below the maternity unit, a man in an expensive navy suit stepped through the hospital's front entrance, carrying a bouquet of white lilies. Billionaire businessman Adrian Whitmore had come to visit his recovering mother after one of her routine medical appointments. He had no idea that before the day ended, a single cry from a newborn baby, one exhausted mother, and one heartbreaking decision made by a man he had never met, would quietly change the direction of his own life forever. Because sometimes, the people who alter our future don't arrive with dramatic speeches. They simply appear at the exact moment someone else walks away. Welcome back to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you love emotional stories that remind us how kindness, courage, and second chances can transform ordinary lives, you're in the right place. Before we continue, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable story. Now, let me ask you something. Have you ever experienced a moment when the person you trusted most disappeared just when you needed them the most? Or perhaps, have you ever witnessed a complete stranger show more compassion than someone who claimed to love you? Today's story isn't just about heartbreak. It's about how painful memories shape the way we see ourselves, how abandonment can leave invisible scars, and how genuine love often arrives quietly, disguised as simple kindness rather than grand promises. Stay with me until the very end, because what the billionaire chose to do after witnessing one mother's darkest hour would not only change her life forever, it would challenge everything both of them believed about love, trust, and what it truly means to stay when life becomes difficult. The coffee maker clicked to life at exactly 5:45 every morning. Jasmine Carter never needed an alarm for it anymore. Even before the rich aroma drifted through the apartment, her eyes would slowly open, almost as if her body had memorized the sound better than any clock ever could. She wrapped a grey cardigan around her shoulders and padded barefoot into the kitchen. Outside, Atlanta was only beginning to wake. Streetlights still glowed softly against the early morning sky, and a light rain tapped gently against the apartment window. Jasmine reached automatically for 2 mugs. She always reached for 2. One white, one navy blue. It wasn't until she placed them on the counter that she paused. Her fingers rested on the blue mug, a little longer than usual. A small smile appeared before quietly fading. She picked it up, looked at it, then slowly returned it to the cabinet. Only 1 cup today, just like yesterday, just like every morning for months. Some habits don't disappear the day a relationship ends. They fade quietly, one forgotten routine at a time. She poured coffee into her own mug before walking toward the nursery. Morning sunlight slipped through pale curtains, casting warm lines across the tiny room. A little boy with thick curls slept peacefully inside a white crib. Caleb, her son. The tiny rise and fall of his chest always reminded her that, despite everything life had taken, it had also given her something extraordinary. She leaned over and gently kissed his forehead. "Good morning, handsome." His tiny fingers stretched before curling around one of hers. He didn't wake. He simply held on. Jasmine smiled. "You've got your mother's habit of not wanting to leave the bed." A quiet laugh escaped her. Moments like this reminded her why she kept going. Not because life had become easier, because someone depended on her finding joy again. By 7 o'clock, Caleb sat happily in his high chair, making a spectacular mess of oatmeal. Jasmine watched him with amused patience. "Oatmeal belongs in your mouth." Caleb answered by dropping his spoon onto the floor. She laughed. "I'll take that as a disagreement." As she cleaned the mess, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was her Aunt Patricia. "Morning, sweetheart." "Morning. You sound tired." "I have a 2-year-old. Patricia chuckled. "Fair point." There was a brief pause before her aunt spoke again. "Have you been sleeping any better?" Jasmine glanced toward Caleb. "Some nights." "And the memories?" That question always landed softly. Never as an accusation, never as pity, simply concern. Jasmine looked out the kitchen window. "They're quieter, but they're still there." Patricia understood immediately. Healing wasn't forgetting. It was remembering without reliving the pain every single time. "You know," Patricia said gently, "your mother used to tell me something after difficult seasons." "What?" "Pain doesn't disappear because we ignore it. It becomes lighter because we learn to carry it differently." Jasmine smiled. "I miss hearing her say things like that." "So do I." They remained silent for a moment. Comfortable silence. The kind shared between people who didn't feel obligated to fill every second with words. "I'll stop by this weekend," Patricia finally said. "Caleb misses you." "I think he mostly misses my cookies." Jasmine laughed. "Probably." After ending the call, she stood quietly by the sink. Her mother's words lingered. Pain becomes lighter because we learn to carry it differently. She hoped that was true. Some mornings it certainly felt true. Others, not so much. At 8:15, Jasmine loaded Caleb into his stroller for their walk to the neighborhood park. Fresh air always helped clear her thoughts. The sidewalks glistened from the earlier rain. Neighbors smiled as they passed. An elderly couple walked hand in hand. A father chased his laughing daughter across a grassy field. Ordinary moments. Simple moments. Yet Jasmine found herself studying them. Not with envy. With curiosity. She wondered what people carried behind those smiles. Everyone seemed to be fighting battles invisible to strangers. That thought had changed her during her years as a labor and delivery nurse. She had watched women become mothers under every imaginable circumstance. Some entered the delivery room surrounded by love. Others entered alone. Some welcomed healthy babies. Others faced heartbreaking uncertainty. Life had taught her something no textbook ever could. Every person carries a story the world cannot see. That realization made kindness easier. Because you never truly know what someone beside you survived before saying good morning. Across town, Adrian Whitmore sat alone in the corner booth of a small neighborhood diner. Despite being one of Atlanta's most successful businessmen, he preferred eating breakfast where the waitress already knew his order. "Same as always?" Martha asked. He smiled. "Please." "Extra toast?" "You remembered." She laughed. "You've been coming here every Thursday for 9 years." Adrian looked around the diner. Nothing had changed. The same worn wooden tables. The same faded photographs on the walls. The same quiet conversations. He liked that. Success had introduced him to luxury hotels, private clubs, and exclusive restaurants. Yet, peace still lived inside places like this. Martha returned, carrying coffee. "You look distracted." "I've been thinking." "Dangerous habit." He laughed softly. "So my mother says." Martha leaned against the counter. "What about?" Adrian stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. "Memory." She raised an eyebrow. "Memory?" "I've been wondering." He looked out the window. "How much of who we become is shaped by what we remember? And how much is shaped by what we refuse to forget?" Martha smiled thoughtfully. "My husband used to say memory is like an old photograph." "How so?" "Every time you look at it, you notice something different." Adrian quietly considered that. Perhaps memories didn't simply preserve the past. Perhaps they quietly changed with us. Back at the park, Caleb spotted a flock of pigeons. He squealed with delight. Jasmine laughed as he pointed excitedly. "You've discovered birds." He clapped enthusiastically. A little girl nearby offered Caleb part of her cracker. Before Jasmine could politely decline, the girl's father smiled. "It's okay. We brought plenty." Jasmine thanked him. The little girl looked at Caleb seriously. "My mommy says sharing makes people feel less lonely." The simple statement caught Jasmine off guard. Children often speak truths adults spend years trying to explain. "It does," Jasmine said gently. "It really does." As the children laughed together, Jasmine realized something. Healing rarely arrived through dramatic moments. Sometimes, it looked like accepting a stranger's kindness, allowing yourself to smile, choosing not to let yesterday steal today's small joys. She took a slow breath. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel quite so frightening. She didn't know that before the day ended, An unexpected encounter at the hospital would awaken memories she had worked hard to quiet, and introduce her to a man whose own past had taught him that the deepest wounds are often the ones no one else can see. By late morning, the sky had cleared. Sunlight spilled across Atlanta, turning the rain-soaked streets into shimmering ribbons of light. Jasmine adjusted Caleb's blanket as she pushed his stroller toward Street Anne's medical center. Even after nearly 2 years away from full-time nursing, she still visited the hospital once every month. Officially, she was there to complete continuing education requirements that kept her nursing license active. Unofficially, she wasn't entirely sure why she kept coming back. Perhaps because part of her heart had never really left. Or perhaps because hospitals had become the only places where joy and heartbreak had always felt honest. There, no one pretended life was predictable. Every hallway carried hope. Every room carried uncertainty. And every birth reminded her that beginnings often arrived disguised as endings. She stepped through the automatic glass doors. The familiar scent of antiseptic, fresh linen, and coffee greeted her almost immediately. Some smells become part of memory. Not because they're pleasant, because they're attached to moments that permanently shape us. The receptionist smiled. "Good morning, Jasmine." "Good morning, Carla. It's good to see you." "You too." Carla leaned over the desk to wave at Caleb. "My goodness. He keeps getting bigger." Jasmine laughed. "He seems determined to grow overnight." Carla smiled warmly. Children usually are. As Jasmine signed the visitor log, her eyes wandered instinctively toward the elevator leading to labor and delivery. She hadn't planned to look. Yet, her heart always found its way there. Almost immediately, the memories returned. Not loudly, quietly, like pages of a book turning by themselves. She remembered the fluorescent lights, the contractions, the frightened silence after Brandon whispered, "I can't do this." She remembered watching him leave. She remembered convincing herself he would come back before the baby arrived. She remembered looking toward the door during every contraction. And finally, she remembered realizing she had been waiting for someone who had already made his choice. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss?" Jasmine blinked. A volunteer stood beside her. "Are you all right?" She smiled politely. "I'm fine." She wasn't lying. She truly was fine. The memory still hurt, but it no longer controlled her. There is an important difference. Healing isn't reaching a place where painful memories disappear. It's reaching a place where they no longer decide how you live today. She quietly thanked the volunteer and headed toward the education wing. Meanwhile, Adrian Whitmore stepped out of the executive elevator carrying a folder beneath one arm. He had come to finalize funding for a new maternal wellness initiative through the Whitmore Foundation. Most people assumed he donated to hospitals because it generated good publicity. Very few knew the truth. He had never forgotten the nurse who held his mother's hand after his father died. He was only 12 years old then. His mother had collapsed from exhaustion after identifying her husband's body. While relatives argued over funeral arrangements, one quiet nurse simply sat beside her. She never offered speeches, never tried to explain grief. She only remained present. Years later, Adrian still couldn't remember that nurse's name. But he remembered exactly how safe his mother looked because someone had chosen not to leave her alone. That memory shaped the man he became. Sometimes, one act of kindness becomes someone else's lifelong compass. Inside the conference room, hospital administrators welcomed Adrian warmly. After reviewing architectural plans and funding reports, the discussion shifted toward maternal health. Dr. Melissa Carter entered, carrying several patient outcome reports. She greeted Adrian with a handshake. "It's good to see you again." "You too, doctor." She smiled. "Your foundation's support has already reduced emergency postpartum readmissions." Adrian nodded. "That's encouraging." Dr. Carter looked thoughtful. "We've learned something important." "What's that?" "Many new mothers don't struggle because they lack medical care." She paused. "They struggle because they lack emotional support." The room became quiet. She continued. "We can treat physical complications, but loneliness," she sighed gently, "requires a different kind of healing." Adrian wrote those words into the margin of his notebook. Loneliness requires a different kind of healing. He underlined the sentence twice. After completing her coursework, Jasmine decided to stop by the labor and delivery floor. Not because she had to, because something inside her wanted to. She walked slowly through the familiar corridor. Nothing had changed. The nurse's station remained exactly where she remembered. The same pastel walls, the same family photographs decorating the hallway, the same lullaby that quietly played whenever a baby was born. She smiled, despite herself. One of the nurses looked up. For a brief second, surprise crossed her face. Then recognition. "Jasmine?" Jasmine smiled. Hi, Emily. Without hesitation, Emily walked around the nurse's station and hugged her. It's so good to see you. You too. Emily stepped back. You look wonderful. I feel better than I did. Emily looked toward Caleb. And this handsome little guy must be Caleb. Jasmine nodded proudly. He certainly is. Emily crouched beside the stroller. Hello there. Caleb responded with an enthusiastic wave. Everyone laughed. He's definitely your son, Emily said. He charms everyone. Jasmine smiled. I'd like to think he got that from my mother. Emily became thoughtful. You know, Dee, we've missed you around here. Jasmine glanced down the hallway. I've missed it too. Emily looked at her carefully. Have you ever thought about coming back? The question lingered. Jasmine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked through the nursery observation window where several newborns slept peacefully. I think about it more often than I admit. Emily nodded knowingly. What stops you? Jasmine smiled sadly. The memories. Emily gently rested a hand on her shoulder. You know what I've learned? What? The place where we're hurt isn't always the place we should avoid. She looked around the maternity unit. Sometimes, it's the place where we discover we've become stronger. Those words settled deeply inside Jasmine. Just then, a young father rushed into the hallway carrying a diaper bag, looking completely overwhelmed. Excuse me. He looked around nervously. I can't find the nursery. Emily immediately stepped forward. I'll show you. Before leaving, she smiled at Jasmine. Don't go anywhere. I'll be right back. The frightened father looked embarrassed. I'm sorry. I've forgotten everything my wife told me. Emily laughed kindly. Happens every day. As they disappeared down the hallway, Jasmine quietly smiled. Fear didn't make someone a bad parent. Refusing to grow from that fear did. That lesson had become painfully personal. Across the corridor, Adrian concluded his meeting and stepped outside. As he walked toward the elevator, he noticed something unusual. A toddler had wandered several feet away from his stroller. Little Caleb giggled happily as he chased a bright yellow balloon rolling down the hallway. The balloon drifted toward the elevator doors just as they began opening. Without thinking, Adrian moved quickly. He gently scooped Caleb into his arms, moments before the little boy reached the closing doors. Caleb blinked at the unfamiliar face, then smiled. A wide, completely trusting smile. Balloon, Caleb announced. Adrian chuckled. I noticed. At that exact moment, Jasmine turned around. For one terrifying second, the stroller was empty. Her heart stopped. Caleb! She hurried forward, then froze. A tall man in a navy suit stood several feet away, calmly holding her son while the yellow balloon rested beneath his polished shoe. Relief washed over her so suddenly that her knees almost gave way. I'm so sorry. She reached Caleb and gently took him back into her arms. He moves faster every day. Adrian smiled kindly. I've noticed. There was no judgment in his voice. Only understanding. Jasmine looked genuinely embarrassed. I only looked away for a second. It only takes a second. He said it gently, not critically. Then he smiled again. The important part is, he's perfectly all right. Caleb looked back and forth between them before proudly pointing toward the balloon. My balloon. Adrian picked it up and handed it to him. I believe this belongs to you. Caleb accepted it with great seriousness. Thank you. Adrian laughed softly. You're welcome. For just a moment, neither adult spoke. There was something unexpectedly calming about the silence. Not awkward, simply peaceful. It felt strangely familiar, as though both of them recognized something in the other they couldn't yet explain. Not attraction, recognition. The quiet recognition of two people who understood what it meant to carry invisible memories while still choosing kindness. Finally, Jasmine smiled. Thank you. She hesitated. I didn't catch your name. Adrian. He extended his hand. Adrian Whitmore. She shifted Caleb slightly before shaking it. Jasmine Carter. Neither realized that this brief encounter, lasting less than 2 minutes, would become a memory both of them would revisit many times in the months ahead. Because the most important relationships rarely begin with fireworks. Sometimes, they begin with a runaway balloon, a frightened mother, a patient stranger, and a simple act of kindness neither person would ever forget. What a heartbreaking beginning. Jasmine's world changed in a single moment, not because she became a mother, but because the person she trusted most chose to walk away when she needed him most. Yet sometimes, the smallest act of kindness from a complete stranger can become the first step toward healing. Before we continue, if this story has touched your heart, Please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable love story filled with powerful life lessons. Now, we'd love to hear from you. If you were in Jasmine's situation, would you ever forgive someone who abandoned you during the most important moment of your life? Or would you close that chapter forever? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective could encourage someone else who's going through a similar experience. Now, let's continue with Chapter 2, where one unexpected reunion begins to uncover how old memories and quiet acts of kindness can change the course of two lives forever. 3 days passed before Jasmine realized she was still thinking about the stranger from the hospital. It wasn't because he was handsome. It wasn't because he was wealthy. In fact, she hadn't even known who Adrian Whitmore was until her aunt casually mentioned seeing him on the evening news accepting an award for community philanthropy. No, what lingered in her mind was something much simpler. When Caleb had wandered away, Adrian hadn't looked at her with criticism. He hadn't sighed impatiently. He hadn't offered unsolicited advice. He had simply helped, then stepped back as though kindness required no applause. That stayed with her. Over the years, Jasmine had become accustomed to people assuming they knew her story after seeing only a single moment. A crying woman, a single mother, a tired parent trying to juggle groceries, a stroller, and life. Everyone seemed to have an opinion. Very few paused long enough to understand. She rinsed Caleb's breakfast bowl while replaying the memory once again. "You're smiling." Jasmine turned. Patricia stood in the kitchen doorway holding a grocery bag. "I didn't hear you come in." "I noticed." Her aunt placed the groceries on the counter before looking at her with playful suspicion. "Now tell me." "Tell you what? Who made you smile while you were washing dishes?" Jasmine laughed. "No one." I know that answer. There really isn't anything to tell." Patricia began unpacking fresh vegetables. "So you're smiling because you're thinking about absolutely nothing?" Jasmine hesitated. "I met someone." Patricia stopped. "Oh? It wasn't like that." Her aunt folded her arms. "I haven't even asked a question yet." Jasmine laughed again. "I know. He helped me at the hospital." "What happened?" Jasmine explained how Caleb had chased the balloon, how panic had flooded her chest, how a complete stranger had calmly picked him up before anything could happen. When she finished, Patricia remained unusually quiet. Finally she asked, "How did he make you feel?" Jasmine frowned slightly. "Safe." The answer surprised even her. She hadn't expected that word. Patricia smiled knowingly. "Sometimes we remember people because of what they did." She gently placed apples into the fruit basket. "And sometimes we remember them because of how we felt around them." Jasmine looked down at the sink. She wasn't ready to admit it aloud. But, for those brief moments in the hospital hallway, she hadn't felt alone. That feeling had become so unfamiliar that her heart noticed it before her mind did. Across the city, Adrian sat in his office overlooking downtown Atlanta. His assistant entered carrying the day's schedule. "You have the board meeting at 10. He nodded. "The foundation review at 1. Another nod. "And?" She smiled. "Your mother called." Adrian looked up. "Is everything all right?" She asked if you'd join her for dinner tonight. A smile appeared immediately. "I'll be there." His assistant paused at the door. "Oh." She also reminded me to remind you. "About what?" "That working 12-hour days isn't a personality trait." Adrian laughed. "That sounds like her." After she left, the office grew quiet again. His eyes drifted toward the city skyline. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, he found himself remembering the young mother from the hospital. Jasmine. He remembered how quickly fear had crossed her face when she realized the stroller was empty. He remembered the relief that followed. More than anything, he remembered her instinct. Before thanking him, before introducing herself, before anything else, she had wrapped both arms around her son, as though reassuring herself he was truly there. Adrian had seen that kind of embrace before. His own mother had held him exactly that way after his father's funeral. Some fears leave fingerprints on the heart, long after life becomes safe again. The heart still reaches instinctively to make sure the people it loves haven't disappeared. That evening, Adrian drove to his mother's house instead of inviting her to one of Atlanta's finest restaurants. Margaret Whitmore preferred homemade meals. She always said conversations tasted better around familiar tables. When Adrian walked inside, the scent of rosemary chicken filled the air. "I hope you're hungry." "I'm always hungry when you cook." She smiled. "Liar." He kissed her cheek before helping carry dishes to the dining table. After they began eating, Margaret studied him carefully. "What? You've been distracted." "I've been thinking." She laughed. "You've inherited that from your grandfather." "I hope that's a compliment." "It depends." She smiled warmly. "What are you thinking about?" Adrian took a slow sip of iced tea. A young mother. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Oh? He briefly described what had happened at the hospital. When he finished, Margaret didn't comment immediately. Instead, she asked, "What do you remember most?" The fear in her eyes. "No," his mother gently corrected. "What do you remember after the fear?" Adrian thought carefully. The way she held her son. Margaret nodded. "Exactly." She leaned back comfortably. "Do you know why?" He shook his head. "Because our minds remember facts." She smiled softly. "Our hearts remember feelings." She reached across the table and gently squeezed his hand. "Never ignore the things your heart remembers." Adrian quietly reflected on those words. His mother rarely offered advice. She preferred asking questions that people carried home with them. The following Monday morning, Jasmine returned to Street Anne's medical center for an interview. Emily had encouraged her to apply for a flexible weekend position in labor and delivery. At first, Jasmine had dismissed the idea. The memories felt too heavy. But over the weekend, she kept asking herself one question. Was she protecting her peace, or allowing fear to decide her future? The distinction mattered. Courage didn't always mean charging into difficult situations. Sometimes courage meant returning to places that reminded you how much you'd grown. She adjusted the strap of her handbag as she stepped into the hospital lobby. Everything looked exactly as it had a few days earlier. The same volunteers, the same reception desk, the same soft piano music drifting through the speakers. This time, however, she noticed something different. She wasn't trembling. She smiled to herself. Healing often happens so gradually that we only recognize it when we realize we no longer react the way we once did. Just as she reached the elevator, someone behind her spoke. "Good morning." The voice sounded familiar. Calm, steady. She turned. Standing a few feet away, holding a folder under one arm, was Adrian Whitmore. For a brief second, both of them looked genuinely surprised. Then, Adrian smiled. "I was hoping our paths might cross again someday." Jasmine couldn't help smiling back. "So was I." Neither of them knew it yet. But some meetings feel like coincidences only because we cannot yet see the quiet work life has been doing behind the scenes. For a brief moment, neither Jasmine nor Adrian moved. The lobby around them remained busy. Visitors crossed from one corridor to another. A volunteer guided an elderly couple toward cardiology wing. Somewhere down the hall, a newborn's lullaby played over the hospital speakers, signaling another safe delivery. Yet for both of them, the noise seemed to fade into the background. Adrian was the first to break the silence. "I wasn't expecting to see you again this soon." Jasmine smiled. "Neither was I." She glanced at the folder in his hand. "Another meeting?" He nodded. "The foundation is reviewing a few new programs with the hospital." "And you?" She lifted the envelope she was carrying. "I'm here for a nursing interview." His expression brightened. "You're coming back?" "I hope so." There was a quiet sincerity in his voice when he replied. "I think that's good news." Jasmine laughed softly. "You don't even know me." "No, but I remember the way you looked at your son." She tilted her head, slightly puzzled. "What do you mean?" Adrian chose his words carefully. "I've met a lot of people who love their children." He paused. "You looked like someone who was grateful simply because he was there." Jasmine's smile faded into thoughtful silence. Very few people noticed things like that. Most remembered appearances, expensive clothes, job titles, confidence. Adrian remembered something much quieter, a feeling. She realized she appreciated that more than she expected. The elevator doors opened. They stepped inside together. For several floors, neither spoke. Oddly enough, the silence wasn't uncomfortable. Jasmine had spent enough years around hospitals to know that silence often carried its own language. People sitting beside loved ones before surgery, parents waiting for test results, doctors preparing difficult conversations. Sometimes silence wasn't empty. Sometimes it was simply respect. When the elevator stopped on the 4th floor, Adrian looked toward her. "I hope your interview goes well." "Thank you." As the doors opened, Jasmine hesitated, then asked, "Would you mind answering something?" "Of course." "You help people you've never met." He smiled. "I try." "Why?" Most people would have answered immediately. Adrian didn't. Instead, he looked down the hallway for a moment before speaking. "When I was 12. My father died unexpectedly." Jasmine's expression softened. "My mother spent weeks pretending she was all right." He smiled faintly. "She fooled almost everyone. But one nurse noticed." He looked back at Jasmine. "She never gave long speeches. She never tried to fix our grief." "What did she do?" "She stayed." He shrugged gently. "Sometimes she'd bring my mother coffee. Sometimes she'd sit beside her for 5 minutes. Sometimes she'd simply ask if we'd eaten. He smiled. I don't remember her face anymore. But I remember how those small acts changed one of the hardest seasons of our lives. Jasmine listened without interrupting. He continued. I think I spend a lot of my life trying to repay a kindness from someone whose name I'll probably never know. The elevator doors began closing. Jasmine looked at him. I hope she knew she made a difference. So do I. The doors closed. As Jasmine walked toward the interview room, she realized something. The people who leave the deepest mark on our lives are often unaware they've done so. That thought stayed with her. The interview lasted nearly an hour. Emily and the nursing supervisor, Karen Douglas, asked about clinical skills, emergency procedures, and balancing motherhood with work. Finally, Karen closed the file. I have one last question. Jasmine nodded. What made you decide to return now? The room became quiet. Jasmine could have given the easy answer. Financial stability, career growth, professional fulfillment. All of those were true. But none of them were the real reason. She folded her hands together. I realized I was waiting to stop remembering. Karen listened. I kept telling myself I'd come back when the memories didn't hurt anymore. She smiled gently. But I don't think healing works that way. Emily smiled from across the table. Jasmine continued. I think healing means learning that painful memories can exist without controlling the decisions we make today. Karen slowly nodded. That's one of the most honest answers I've heard. She closed the folder. I think our patients could learn as much from your life as they will from your medical training. Jasmine left the room unsure whether she had the job, but she walked out feeling lighter than when she had walked in. Sometimes, speaking the truth out loud changes us before it changes anyone else. Across the hospital, Adrian finished reviewing plans for the Whitmore Foundation's newest project. The proposal focused on supporting mothers during the first year after childbirth, counseling, home visits, parenting workshops, emergency assistance. When the meeting ended, Sophia Bennett walked beside him. You've been unusually passionate about this project. Adrian smiled. I suppose I have. She looked curious. Any particular reason? He thought for a moment. I've realized something. What? We spend millions helping people survive medical emergencies. She nodded. Which matters. It does. But some people survive the emergency. He paused. And then spend years recovering from what happened emotionally. Sophia smiled thoughtfully. I couldn't agree more. She looked at him. That perspective will help a lot of families. Later that afternoon, Jasmine collected Caleb from the hospital daycare center. The little boy ran toward her with open arms. Mama! She laughed as he wrapped himself around her legs. Did you have fun? He nodded enthusiastically. We colored. Oh? And I made a dinosaur. A dinosaur? He proudly held up a piece of paper, covered in enthusiastic green scribbles. She smiled, as though she had just been handed a priceless masterpiece. It's perfect. Children have a remarkable gift. They don't create for approval. They create because joy is reason enough. Jasmine wished adults remembered that more often. As she tucked the drawing into her bag, she noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. Adrian. He was speaking with an elderly volunteer before turning and seeing her. He smiled. I was hoping your interview went well. She returned the smile. I think it did. I had a feeling. Caleb peeked shyly from behind Jasmine's leg before recognizing him. Balloon Man. Adrian laughed. I suppose that's my official title now. Caleb nodded seriously. You saved my balloon. I did. The little boy disappeared into his backpack and returned carrying a small red crayon drawing. He held it out with both hands. For you. Jasmine looked surprised. When did you draw that? This morning. The picture showed 3 stick figures. One was noticeably taller than the others. Above them floated a large yellow balloon. Adrian accepted it carefully. This is one of the nicest gifts I've ever received. Caleb grinned proudly. Children often measure gratitude differently than adults. To Caleb, sharing his drawing was as meaningful as giving away something expensive. Adrian folded the picture carefully instead of slipping it casually into his briefcase. Jasmine noticed. That simple act told her something. He understood that gifts should be treated according to the heart behind them, not their price. As they stood outside the hospital beneath the warm afternoon sun, neither of them realized they had spent nearly 20 minutes talking. About books, favorite parks, coffee, children, nothing extraordinary, yet everything important. Because trust is rarely built during dramatic moments. It grows through ordinary conversations, where 2 people slowly realize they don't have to pretend. As they prepared to leave, Adrian hesitated. I know this might sound unexpected. Jasmine looked at him. But, if you ever need someone to review ideas for the hospital's new maternal support program. He smiled politely. I'd value hearing your perspective. She looked genuinely surprised. You barely know me. I know enough to believe you'd tell me the truth. For reasons she couldn't fully explain, that simple statement touched her more deeply than any compliment had in years. She smiled. I'd like that. They said goodbye and walked in opposite directions. Neither looked back immediately. But, before reaching the parking lot, both of them turned at almost exactly the same moment. Their eyes met across the distance. They smiled, then continued walking. Sometimes the beginning of something meaningful doesn't announce itself. It simply asks two people to keep showing up. The email arrived just after sunrise. Jasmine almost deleted it without opening it. For weeks, every message from the hospital had been another automated notice, another reminder about paperwork, another training update she had already completed. She balanced her coffee mug in one hand while Caleb sat on the kitchen floor building an impossibly crooked tower from colorful wooden blocks. Mama! He held up the tallest block with obvious excitement. Look! Jasmine smiled. That's a very tall building. He placed the final block on top. The tower stood proudly for exactly 2 seconds before collapsing into a noisy pile. Caleb stared at it. Then, to Jasmine's surprise, he laughed. He didn't cry. He didn't become frustrated. He simply started building again. Jasmine watched him quietly. Children rarely fear beginning again. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, many people learn to believe that failure is evidence they shouldn't try anymore. She hoped Caleb never lost that courage. Her phone vibrated. She finally opened the email. Congratulations, Jasmine Carter. We are pleased to offer you the position of weekend labor and delivery registered nurse. She covered her mouth with one hand. A deep breath escaped her lungs. She had done it, not because the memories had disappeared, but because she had decided they would no longer determine the direction of her life. She scooped Caleb into her arms. We're going back. He blinked. Hospital? She laughed. Yes. Mama's going back to the hospital. Caleb clapped enthusiastically. Yay! He had no idea why she was smiling. He simply knew she was. Sometimes joy is contagious before it's understood. That afternoon, Jasmine called her Aunt Patricia. I got it. On the other end of the phone came a delighted scream. I knew you would. Jasmine laughed. I wasn't nearly as confident. You've spent years taking care of people. Patricia replied. The hospital is lucky to have you back. Jasmine looked out the living room window. I think. She paused. I think I was waiting for someone to tell me I was ready. And? No one ever did. Patricia smiled through the phone. So what changed? Jasmine glanced toward Caleb, who was now trying to convince his stuffed bear to eat imaginary cereal. I realized I didn't need permission. Silence settled between them for a moment. Then Patricia spoke softly. That's one of the hardest lessons adults ever learn. What is? Waiting for other people to validate decisions we already know are right. Jasmine smiled. For years, she had confused fear with wisdom. They weren't the same thing. Fear whispers that staying still is safer. Wisdom reminds us that growth almost always requires movement. Across the city, Adrian sat through another board meeting. Quarterly reports, investment forecasts, expansion proposals. Everything proceeded efficiently. Yet his attention drifted. Not because the meeting lacked importance, because his thoughts kept returning to an idea discussed at the hospital. Supporting mothers after childbirth. The statistics had unsettled him. Not the financial figures, the human ones. Many women quietly struggled long after family and friends assumed life had returned to normal. Loneliness, anxiety, emotional exhaustion. The numbers represented real people, real stories, real children. Daniel Reynolds, his longtime attorney and closest friend, noticed Adrian staring absently out the conference room window. You've disappeared. Adrian smiled faintly. Have I? For the last 5 minutes. After the meeting ended, the two men walked toward Adrian's office. Daniel closed the door behind them. What's on your mind? Adrian leaned against the window overlooking the city. I met someone. Daniel raised an eyebrow. Now you've definitely got my attention. Adrian laughed. It's not like that. Daniel folded his arms. That's exactly what every man says before it turns out to be like that. Adrian shook his head. She's a nurse. The one from the hospital? You knew? Daniel smiled. You've mentioned the hospital 3 times this week. You almost never talk about strangers. Adrian considered that. Perhaps Daniel was right. Perhaps Jasmine had occupied more of his thoughts than he realized. Still, It wasn't romance. At least, not yet. It was curiosity. There was something about her quiet strength that reminded him of people who had survived storms without becoming bitter. Those people always interested him. Not because they were extraordinary, because they revealed what resilience actually looked like. Saturday arrived sooner than Jasmine expected. Her first shift back at Street. Anne's medical center began at 7 o'clock. She stood outside the employee entrance for several seconds before walking inside. The same hallway. The same polished floors. The same scent of fresh coffee drifting from the staff lounge. Only one thing had changed. Her. Emily spotted her almost immediately. There she is. Several nurses looked up and smiled. One by one, they welcomed her back. No dramatic speeches, no awkward sympathy, just genuine happiness. It reminded Jasmine how important belonging truly is. People often underestimate the healing power of being welcomed. Emily handed her a locker key. Ready? Jasmine took a deep breath. I think so. Emily grinned. You don't have to be fearless. You just have to take the first step. Jasmine nodded. She opened her locker. Inside, someone had taped a handwritten note to the mirror. Welcome home, Jasmine. She smiled before she even realized tears had filled her eyes. Sometimes, home isn't where painful memories disappear. It's where new ones begin replacing them. Her first patient arrived less than an hour later. 23-year-old Olivia Martinez. 38 weeks pregnant. First baby. Terrified. I'm scared, Olivia admitted as Jasmine checked her blood pressure. Jasmine smiled reassuringly. So was I. Olivia looked surprised. You have a child? I do. A little boy. Were you afraid too? Jasmine nodded honestly. Very. Olivia relaxed slightly. What if I do everything wrong? Jasmine gently adjusted the blanket over Olivia's legs. Can I tell you something someone once told me? Olivia nodded. The perfect parent doesn't exist. She smiled. But loving parents learn. They ask questions. They apologize when they make mistakes. They keep showing up. Olivia smiled. That sounds more possible. It is. Jasmine realized she wasn't just encouraging Olivia. She was reminding herself. Meanwhile, Adrian arrived at the hospital for an afternoon planning session about the new maternal wellness program. As he crossed the lobby, he noticed a colorful display created by the pediatric unit. Pinned across one wall were hundreds of children's drawings. One picture immediately caught his eye. 3 stick figures. 1 yellow balloon. He smiled. Not Caleb's drawing, but close enough to remind him. Funny how memories worked. A simple sketch could transport someone back to a hallway, a conversation, a feeling they hadn't expected to remember. Just then, he heard a familiar laugh echo from the corridor leading toward labor and delivery. He turned instinctively. For a brief moment, he saw Jasmine through the open nurses' station. She was kneeling beside a frightened young mother, speaking so softly that Adrian couldn't hear the words. But he noticed something else. The woman's shoulders slowly relaxed. The fear on her face eased. She smiled. Adrian watched for only a few seconds before quietly continuing down the hallway. He didn't interrupt. He understood something important. Compassion deserved privacy. Still, one thought stayed with him. Some people heal others without ever realizing they are doing it. And, perhaps, those are the people the world needs most. The rest of Jasmine's shift passed in a steady rhythm. New admissions. Routine checkups. An anxious father who accidentally brought the hospital bag without his wife's clothes. A grandmother who cried louder than the woman in labor. Moments that, years ago, would have blended together now felt different. Not because the work had changed, because Jasmine had. She noticed things she used to overlook. A husband silently rubbing his wife's back through every contraction. A teenage father reading aloud from a parenting booklet because he was too nervous to sit still. A nurse quietly covering another nurse's patients so she could step into the break room and collect herself after a difficult delivery. Kindness was everywhere. It rarely made headlines. It rarely attracted attention. Yet it held entire days together. She was charting patient notes when Dr. Rebecca Collins approached. It's good having you back. Jasmine looked up and smiled. Thank you. Rebecca leaned against the nurse's station. You seem lighter. Jasmine laughed softly. I've heard that a few times lately. Do you feel lighter? Jasmine considered the question. I don't think life is lighter. She looked down the hallway toward the maternity rooms. I think I'm stronger. Rebecca smiled. There's a difference. There is. The doctor nodded approvingly. Strength doesn't always remove the weight. It simply allows us to carry it differently. Jasmine smiled. My aunt said almost the same thing last week. Wise woman. The wisest I know. Rebecca gently squeezed her shoulder before walking away. Jasmine watched her disappear into another patient's room. She realized something. The people who had influenced her life the most had rarely given dramatic advice. Instead, they offered quiet truths exactly when she needed them. Perhaps wisdom wasn't about saying something extraordinary. Perhaps it was about saying the right thing at the right time. Across the hospital, Adrian's meeting had ended earlier than expected. Most of the committee members had already left. He lingered behind, reviewing notes for the maternal wellness project. Sophia Bennett closed her laptop. "You look dissatisfied." Adrian glanced up. "Do I?" "You've crossed out half your proposal." He smiled. "I think we're solving the wrong problem." Sophia folded her arms. "Explain." "We're creating programs." She nodded. "Yes. But programs don't automatically make people feel supported." She remained quiet. Adrian continued. "What if we asked mothers what they actually need, instead of assuming we already know?" Sophia's eyes brightened. "So, instead of designing for them, we design with them." "Exactly." She smiled. "I like that." He looked thoughtful. "I've seen too many organizations mistake good intentions for understanding." Sophia closed her notebook. "Experience has taught you that?" Adrian shook his head. "Listening has." As Adrian left the conference room, he passed the hospital cafe. The line stretched almost to the entrance. Near the back, he spotted a familiar face. Jasmine stood waiting with a reusable coffee cup in one hand while reading something on her phone. She hadn't noticed him. He debated whether to interrupt. Before he could decide, someone else reached her first. A man, in expensive running clothes, wrapped an arm casually around her shoulders. Adrian instinctively looked away. He wasn't sure why. The conversation lasted only a few seconds. The man laughed. Jasmine smiled politely. Then the man continued toward the exit. Adrian frowned almost imperceptibly. Something about the exchange felt distant, not warm, not uncomfortable, simply unfamiliar. By the time Adrian reached the counter, Jasmine noticed him. "Mr. Balloon Man?" He laughed. "I was beginning to think that name would follow me forever." "It might." She smiled. "It's memorable." He nodded toward the exit. "Friend of yours?" She followed his glance. "Oh." A small smile crossed her face. "My cousin, Isaiah. He works nearby." Adrian felt unexpectedly relieved. The feeling caught him off guard. He quickly changed the subject. "Long shift?" 12 hours. "You still look energetic." She laughed. "I assure you, appearances are misleading." The barista called Jasmine's name. She picked up her coffee. "So," Adrian asked, "how did your first week back go?" She looked down at the cup for a moment before answering. "I was afraid the memories would overwhelm me." "And?" "They didn't." She smiled softly. "They simply reminded me how far I've come." Adrian admired the honesty in her answer. Many people tried to sound stronger than they felt. Jasmine seemed comfortable admitting both her struggles and her growth. That combination was rare. Later that evening, Jasmine drove home with Caleb asleep in the back seat. Traffic moved slowly through the city. She glanced at him in the rearview mirror. His tiny hands still clutched the stuffed elephant he refused to sleep without. She smiled. Then her thoughts drifted unexpectedly toward Adrian. Not because she imagined romance. Because she felt curious. He asked thoughtful questions. He listened carefully. Most importantly, he never seemed in a hurry to prove anything. She remembered Brandon. In the beginning, he had always filled silence. Every quiet moment became another story about himself. Another ambitious plan. Another promise about the future. Back then, Jasmine mistook constant talking for emotional openness. Now, she understood the difference. Someone can tell you everything about their dreams, while revealing almost nothing about their heart. Adrian was the opposite. He said little, but somehow she had learned more about his character in 3 conversations than she'd learned about Brandon during their first 6 months together. That realization made her pause. Memory was strange. Sometimes, it clarified the past. The following Wednesday, the Whitmore Foundation hosted a planning workshop inside the hospital auditorium. Doctors, nurses, social workers, community volunteers, hospital administrators. Everyone was invited to share ideas. Jasmine almost didn't attend. She assumed people with executive titles preferred hearing from department heads rather than bedside nurses. Emily practically pushed her toward the auditorium. "You belong in that room." "I don't know." "You spend more time with new mothers than most of the people giving presentations." Emily smiled. "If anyone understands what families need, it's you." Reluctantly, Jasmine took a seat near the back. At precisely 6 o'clock, Adrian stepped onto the stage. He didn't begin with statistics. He didn't begin with funding. Instead, he looked around the room and asked one simple question. What is the hardest part of becoming a parent that no one prepares people for? Silence. Then someone answered, the loneliness. Another voice spoke, the guilt. Feeling like you're failing. Asking for help. One answer became another. Soon, the entire room was talking. Adrian never interrupted. He simply listened and wrote notes. Jasmine watched quietly. Leadership, she realized, looked very different from what she'd imagined. It wasn't about having the loudest voice. It was about creating space for other voices to be heard. Toward the end of the workshop, Adrian looked around the room. Would anyone like to share a personal experience? The room fell quiet again. Jasmine lowered her eyes. She had no intention of speaking. Then she remembered Olivia, the frightened first-time mother she'd comforted days earlier. She remembered her own delivery. She remembered how alone she'd felt. Almost without realizing it, her hand slowly rose. Adrian noticed immediately. Yes. Jasmine stood. The room turned toward her. My name is Jasmine. She smiled nervously. I'm a labor and delivery nurse. And a single mother. The room remained completely still. I've learned something. She took a slow breath. When a woman gives birth, everyone asks if the baby is healthy. She smiled gently. And they should. She paused. But after a few days, someone should also ask, how is the mother doing? Silence. The kind that arrives when people recognize an uncomfortable truth. Jasmine continued. Some women go home to strong support systems. Others go home to empty apartments. Many smile because they don't want anyone to worry. She looked around the room. But strength isn't pretending you're okay. It's knowing you're safe enough to admit when you're not. When she finished, no one spoke for several seconds. Then, the auditorium filled with applause. Not loud, not dramatic, sincere. Adrian remained standing near the podium, looking directly at Jasmine, not because she had given the longest speech, because she had spoken the truth everyone else had almost overlooked. In that moment, he understood exactly who needed to help shape the future of the Whitmore Foundation's maternal wellness initiative. And for the first time, Jasmine realized that someone wasn't simply hearing her words. Someone truly understood them. The applause lingered in Jasmine's mind long after the workshop ended. Not because people had clapped, because they had listened. There was a difference. For years, she had become skilled at telling people she was fine. She had mastered the polite smile, the reassuring answer, the quick change of subject whenever conversations wandered too close to her own pain. Standing in front of that room had been different. For the first time in a long while, she had spoken honestly without worrying whether honesty would make other people uncomfortable. As she gathered her notebook, Emily caught up with her. I told you. Jasmine laughed. You did. You belonged in there. Jasmine shook her head modestly. I just shared my experience. Emily smiled knowingly. Exactly. She rested a hand on Jasmine's shoulder. People don't always remember presentations. They remember authenticity. Those words followed Jasmine all the way to the parking lot. Authenticity. She thought about that word during the drive home. Perhaps authenticity wasn't about revealing every painful detail. Perhaps it was simply refusing to pretend to be someone you weren't. The next morning, Adrian arrived at his office, carrying the notebook from the workshop. Instead of heading directly into meetings, he closed the door and reread every page. Dozens of ideas filled the margins. Longer postpartum support, community mentors, fatherhood classes, mental health counseling, flexible childcare resources. Yet one sentence stood apart from all the others. He had circled it twice. Strength isn't pretending you're okay. It's knowing you're safe enough to admit when you're not. He knew exactly who had said it. He also knew it captured everything the foundation had been missing. Programs could provide services, but people also needed places where honesty felt safe. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel Reynolds stepped inside. You've been hiding in here. I've been reading. Daniel glanced at the notebook. The workshop? Adrian nodded. I think we've been approaching this project backwards. Daniel smiled. I'm sensing another redesign. Probably. He handed Daniel the notebook. Read the highlighted sentence. Daniel did. A slow smile spread across his face. That's remarkably insightful. It is. Who said it? A nurse. Daniel looked up. The same nurse? Adrian smiled. The same nurse. Daniel laughed quietly. You know, it's becoming increasingly difficult for you to pretend she's just another person you happen to meet. Adrian leaned back in his chair. I don't know her well enough to make assumptions. No, Daniel agreed. But you seem interested in knowing her better. Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked back toward the notebook. I'm interested in understanding why some people make others feel understood. Daniel nodded thoughtfully. That's a better reason than most. At St. Anne's Medical Center, Jasmine's shift was unusually calm. She spent the morning helping first-time parents learn how to care for newborns. One young father looked terrified as he attempted to swaddle his daughter. I think she hates me. Jasmine smiled. The baby? He nodded. Every time I hold her, she cries. She gently adjusted the blanket around the little girl. Babies don't measure confidence. They measure comfort. He frowned. I don't understand. They don't need perfect parents. She smiled. They need patient ones. The father tried again. This time, the baby settled almost immediately. His eyes widened. I did it. You did? He laughed with obvious relief. I thought I'd fail. Jasmine looked at him kindly. The willingness to keep trying is one of the best qualities a parent can have. As she walked away, she couldn't help smiling. She had spent years believing encouragement was something only children needed. Life had taught her otherwise. Adults needed encouragement just as much, sometimes even more. Just after lunch, Karen Douglas approached the nurse's station carrying a sealed envelope. This came for you. Jasmine looked surprised. For me? Karen nodded. It was hand-delivered. Curious, Jasmine opened it. Inside was a formal invitation. Whitmore Foundation. Maternal Wellness Advisory Council. She read the letter twice before looking back at Karen. There must be some mistake. Karen smiled. I don't think so. The letter invited Jasmine to serve on a volunteer advisory council made up of nurses, physicians, counselors, and parents. Its purpose was simple. Help design programs based on real experiences instead of assumptions. At the bottom of the page was a handwritten note. Your perspective deserves a seat at the table. Adrian Whitmore. Jasmine stared at the note, not because it felt romantic, because it felt respectful. He hadn't invited her because he felt sorry for her. He hadn't offered charity. He had recognized something she had to say. That mattered, more than she expected. That evening, she sat on Patricia's back porch while Caleb chased bubbles across the yard. She handed her aunt the invitation. Patricia adjusted her reading glasses. When she finished, she smiled. So, what do you think? Jasmine asked. I think someone noticed your wisdom. Jasmine laughed. I don't know about wisdom. I do. Her aunt folded the letter carefully. Tell me honestly. What scares you? Jasmine looked toward Caleb. What if I don't belong there? Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she asked, when Caleb started learning to walk, did he belong on his feet before he took the first step? Jasmine smiled. I suppose not. He belonged because he was willing to learn. Patricia reached for her tea. The same applies here. She continued gently. Never confuse unfamiliar places with places you don't deserve to be. Jasmine let those words settle. How many opportunities had she quietly declined because she assumed someone else was more qualified? Fear often disguised itself as humility. She was finally beginning to recognize the difference. The following Tuesday evening, the first advisory council meeting took place in one of the hospital's community conference rooms. The room wasn't grand, just a circle of tables, coffee, notebooks, simple name cards. Adrian greeted each person personally, not as a billionaire, not as a donor, simply as another participant. When Jasmine arrived, he smiled warmly. I'm glad you came. She returned the smile. I almost didn't. I'm even more glad you came then. The meeting began without speeches. Instead, Adrian placed a single question on a whiteboard. What does every new parent deserve? One by one, people answered. Respect, honest information, rest, patience, community, grace. Jasmine listened carefully, then wrote one word on her notepad. Presence. Adrian noticed. Would you explain that? She looked around the room before answering. I think many people try very hard to solve someone else's pain. She paused. But often, what people need first is someone willing to stay with them while they're hurting. The room fell thoughtfully quiet. An older social worker nodded. That's true. Another counselor smiled. We spend so much time looking for the right words. We forget our presence often speaks louder. Adrian wrote the word in large letters across the whiteboard. Presence. He underlined it once, then looked back at Jasmine. Thank you. She smiled modestly. No. She looked around the room. Thank all of you. Because every idea shared tonight came from someone who cared enough to listen before speaking. As the discussion continued, Adrian found himself watching how Jasmine interacted with everyone. She never interrupted. She encouraged quieter participants to share. She acknowledged ideas before offering her own. Leadership, he realized, wasn't always visible. Sometimes it appeared in the person making sure everyone else felt seen. When the meeting finally ended, neither of them noticed the 2 full hours had passed. Time had disappeared. Not because anything dramatic happened, because meaningful conversations have a way of making people forget to watch the clock. As they walked toward the parking lot together, a cool evening breeze rustled the trees lining the sidewalk. Neither hurried to leave. Neither searched for impressive things to say. For the first time, both sensed that what was growing between them wasn't excitement. It was trust. And trust, they were both learning, grows quietly, one honest conversation at a time. The evening air carried the scent of fresh rain as Adrian and Jasmine stepped out of the hospital together. For a few moments, they walked in comfortable silence toward the parking lot. Cars pulled away one after another, their headlights stretching across the wet pavement. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled softly, though the storm itself had already passed. Jasmine smiled to herself. It's funny. Adrian glanced at her. What is? I've worked in this hospital for years. She looked toward the entrance. I've walked through these parking lots hundreds of times. And? I don't think I've ever noticed how peaceful it is after everyone leaves. Adrian looked around before answering. I think we're usually too busy thinking about where we're going. He smiled. We forget to notice where we are. Jasmine laughed quietly. You have a habit of saying things that make people think. So I've been told. Is that intentional? He shook his head. Not really. I've just learned that people reveal interesting things when conversations aren't rushed. She looked at him thoughtfully. Most people are uncomfortable with silence. I used to be. What changed? Adrian took a slow breath. My father. Jasmine waited. He believed every silence had to be filled. He smiled faintly. He was charming. He could start conversations with anyone. What about you? I spent years trying to become more like him. And? I eventually realized I wasn't failing. He smiled. I was simply different. Jasmine nodded. My aunt says comparison is one of the quickest ways to lose gratitude. Adrian looked at her with genuine interest. She sounds wise. She is. Does she always know the right thing to say? Jasmine laughed. No. But she usually knows the right question to ask. They reached their cars, but neither unlocked the door. The conversation still felt unfinished. Not because they needed to impress one another, because neither wanted to rush something that felt unexpectedly genuine. The next Saturday morning, the advisory council met again. This time, Adrian surprised everyone. Instead of gathering in the conference room, he arranged the chairs in a large circle inside one of the hospital's family resource centers. There was no podium, no presentation screen, no long table separating executives from nurses. Just one circle, one conversation. Sophia smiled as she looked around. This feels different. Adrian nodded. It should. He waited until everyone had settled before speaking. I've spent years attending meetings where the people making decisions sat at one end of the room, while the people living with those decisions sat at the other. Several participants nodded. I don't think we're going to do that anymore. Jasmine looked around the circle. Everyone sat at the same level. Everyone's name card looked exactly the same. No titles, no executive labels, just first names. She smiled. Small choices often communicate big values. About halfway through the meeting, Adrian placed several handwritten cards in the center of the circle. Each contained a different question. He explained, I don't want us talking about programs today. I'd rather talk about people. Everyone picked a card. Jasmine unfolded hers. What memory still shapes the way you care for other people? She stared at the question for several seconds. It reached somewhere deeper than she expected. One by one, participants began sharing. A pediatrician spoke about losing his younger sister to leukemia. A social worker described growing up with a mother who struggled with depression. A father admitted he still remembered how frightened he felt the first night he brought his newborn home. No one interrupted. No one tried to fix anyone else's story. They simply listened. When it became Jasmine's turn, she hesitated, then looked down at the card again. I remember. She paused. The silence. The room remained completely still. The silence after someone leaves. She looked at her hands. When Caleb's father walked out during my labor. The loudest memory I carried wasn't the argument. It wasn't even the pain. She smiled sadly. It was how quiet the room suddenly felt. She looked around the circle. I spent a long time believing silence always meant abandonment. Her voice softened. But over the past few months, I've discovered silence can also mean peace. It depends on who's standing beside you. No one spoke. Several people quietly wiped away tears. Not because the story was dramatic, because it was honest. Adrian didn't say anything immediately. He simply nodded. Sometimes the greatest respect you can offer another person is allowing their words to settle before responding. When Adrian's turn came, he looked down at his own card. What lesson took you the longest to learn? He smiled faintly. I thought success would make me feel secure. A few people exchanged curious glances. It didn't. He looked around the room. I spent years believing that if I worked hard enough, I earned enough, achieved enough, say, I'd never have to feel the uncertainty I felt after losing my father. He folded the card carefully. What I eventually learned was this. No amount of success heals pain we refuse to acknowledge. The room remained quiet. So, now, he smiled gently. I spend less time asking people what they've accomplished, and more time asking how they're really doing. Jasmine found herself smiling, not because of his words, because she believed them. There was no performance in his voice, only experience. After the meeting, several members stayed behind to help clean up. Jasmine stacked coffee cups while Adrian gathered notebooks from the tables. At one point, they both reached for the same folder. Their hands brushed briefly. Both smiled. You first. Adrian stepped back. No. She laughed. I insist. He handed her the folder. My mother would approve. Oh? She believes good manners reveal character. Jasmine smiled. My aunt says almost the same thing. They laughed. Then Jasmine grew thoughtful. Can I ask you something? Always. You've told me a little about your father. He nodded. But you talk about your mother much more. Adrian leaned lightly against the table. My mother had to become two parents overnight. He smiled softly. She never pretended it was easy. What did she teach you? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the now empty meeting room. She taught me that grief and gratitude can exist in the same heart. Jasmine frowned slightly. What do you mean? The year after my father died, she cried almost every night. He smiled gently. But every morning, she still found one thing to be thankful for. He looked at Jasmine. She said gratitude doesn't erase pain. It simply reminds us that pain isn't the whole story. Jasmine looked down for a moment. She thought about Caleb, about Patricia, about returning to nursing, about unexpected conversations with Adrian. Maybe, without realizing it, she had been practicing gratitude too. Several days later, Jasmine received an unexpected voicemail during her lunch break. She recognized the voice instantly. It was Brandon. She hadn't heard from him in almost 8 months. The message was brief. Jasmine. Oh, I know I probably don't deserve a conversation, but I'd like to see Caleb. If you're willing. Please, call me. She stared at the phone. Her heartbeat slowed. Not because she wanted him back, because hearing his voice awakened memories she believed had finally settled. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply sat quietly. Then she placed the phone face down on the table. Emily walked into the break room a few moments later. You okay? Jasmine looked up. I don't know yet. Emily sat beside her without asking questions. For several minutes, neither woman spoke. Eventually, Jasmine smiled. Thank you. Emily looked surprised. I didn't do anything. You stayed. Emily smiled gently. Sometimes that's enough. Jasmine remembered the word she had written during the advisory meeting. Presence. Perhaps that lesson wasn't only meant for other people. Perhaps she needed it herself. Outside the break room window, rain began falling once again. Inside, Jasmine took a slow, steady breath. For the first time since hearing Brandon's voice, she realized she didn't have to decide anything today. Some decisions deserve time, and emotional maturity isn't measured by how quickly we respond. It's measured by whether we respond from wisdom instead of woundedness. She quietly picked up her phone again. Not to call Brandon. Not yet. Simply to acknowledge that the past had knocked on her door. And this time, she was strong enough to decide whether to answer. Jasmine didn't return Brandon's call. Not that day. Not the next one either. She listened to the voicemail one final time before deleting it. The words themselves weren't what stayed with her. It was the feeling they awakened. For months, she had worked hard to rebuild a life that wasn't organized around disappointment. She had created routines for herself and Caleb. She had returned to nursing. She had learned to enjoy ordinary mornings again. One unexpected voicemail reminded her how easily old memories could mistake themselves for unfinished business. She set her phone on the kitchen counter and poured cereal into Caleb's bowl. "Mama?" "Yes?" "I need the blue spoon." She opened the drawer. "You always need the blue spoon." He nodded very seriously. "It tastes better." She laughed as she handed it to him. "Then the blue spoon it is." Watching Caleb happily eat his breakfast reminded her of something she often forgot. Children rarely carry yesterday into today. They wake up expecting life to be lived, not replayed. Adults, on the other hand, often relive old conversations while completely missing the new ones happening in front of them. She silently promised herself she wouldn't allow one voicemail to steal another peaceful morning. Across town, Adrian was visiting his mother before heading to the office. Margaret had recently started planting vegetables in her backyard again, insisting that retirement was too quiet without dirt under her fingernails. Adrian found her kneeling beside a row of tomato plants. "I thought billionaires hired gardeners." She smiled without looking up. "I thought successful sons knew better than to tease their mothers." He laughed and picked up the watering can. "Fair enough." For several minutes they worked without speaking. Margaret believed conversation should never interrupt peaceful work. Eventually she broke the silence. "Something's changed." Adrian looked at her. "What makes you say that?" "You've been smiling more." "I have?" She nodded. "You've also stopped checking your phone every 30 seconds. He laughed. "I didn't realize you were keeping score. A mother notices things." She stood, brushing soil from her gloves. "Is there someone making life more interesting?" Adrian smiled to himself. "There is someone I've enjoyed getting to know." Margaret's eyes twinkled. "The nurse?" He looked genuinely surprised. "Daniel talks too much." "No." She laughed. "You do. I've barely mentioned her." "You didn't have to." Margaret placed a gentle hand on his arm. "The people who matter reveal themselves by how often they quietly enter our conversations." Adrian looked toward the garden. "I'm not rushing anything." "I hope you don't." She smiled warmly. "The best relationships grow the same way these plants do. Slowly, patiently, and with consistent care." She pointed toward the tomatoes. "You can't pull on a plant to make it grow faster." He nodded thoughtfully. "Some things flourish only when they're given time." That afternoon, Jasmine finished her shift and found an envelope waiting in her locker. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for reminding us that listening is one of the greatest forms of care. Your perspective has already improved our planning sessions, Adrian." There was no expensive stationery, no grand gesture, no hidden meaning, just gratitude. She smiled, then folded the note and tucked it carefully into her notebook instead of throwing it away. Emily noticed. "Good news?" Jasmine handed her the note. Emily read it before smiling. "That's thoughtful." "It is." "What are you thinking?" Jasmine leaned against the locker. "I'm thinking." She searched for the right words. "It's nice to be appreciated for something other than surviving." Emily looked at her carefully. "What do you mean?" "For a long time, people admired how strong I was." She shrugged gently. "I know they meant well. But I didn't want my whole identity to become." She paused. "The woman who was abandoned." Emily nodded slowly. "I wanted someone to notice the person I was becoming." She smiled at the note. "I think someone finally did." Later that evening, the advisory council gathered for another planning session. This meeting focused on practical support for new parents during the first 6 months after childbirth. Ideas filled the whiteboard. Free parenting classes, peer support groups, meal delivery partnerships, flexible counseling appointments. As the discussion continued, Adrian turned toward Jasmine. "If you could change one thing about postpartum care," he asked gently, "what would it be?" The room waited. Jasmine didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked around at the faces listening to her. "I'd change one question." Several people looked curious. "What question?" She smiled. "Instead of asking mothers, no, how's the baby?" She paused. "I'd also ask, how are you becoming?" Silence settled over the room. A counselor spoke first. "Becoming?" Jasmine nodded. "We spend so much time asking people how they're doing, but very little time asking who they're becoming through what they're experiencing." She looked around the circle. "Motherhood changes your schedule. It changes your body. It changes your priorities. But it also changes your identity. She smiled gently. And identity deserves attention too. Adrian slowly wrote the sentence across the whiteboard. How are you becoming? He stepped back and looked at it for a long moment. I think, he said quietly, that may be the most important question we've asked since this project began. When the meeting ended, rain had started falling again. Not a storm, just a slow, steady drizzle. Jasmine stood beneath the hospital entrance, waiting for it to ease. I think the weather has decided we're becoming friends. She turned to find Adrian standing beside her. She laughed. It certainly has interesting timing. He looked toward the parking lot. I parked on the far side. So did I. For a moment, they watched the rain in silence. Then Adrian asked, Can I ask you something? You've earned a few questions. He smiled. When you talked about becoming. He hesitated. Who do you think you've become? Jasmine didn't answer immediately. She watched the raindrops ripple across the pavement. I think, she said softly, I've become someone who's less afraid of telling the truth. She looked at him, not because the truth is easier, but because pretending became too exhausting. Adrian nodded. I understand that. She studied him for a moment. What about you? He smiled faintly. I've become someone who's finally learning that being dependable matters more than appearing impressive. The words lingered between them. Neither felt the need to explain further. Some conversations become meaningful, precisely because they leave room for quiet understanding. As the rain gradually softened, they walked toward the parking lot together. Not because either of them needed company, but because, without saying it aloud, both had begun to realize that the journey felt a little lighter when someone else was willing to walk beside them. Monday mornings always began the same way for Jasmine. Coffee, a quick breakfast with Caleb, a short drive to Patricia's house before heading to the hospital. Routine had become one of the quiet blessings in her life. There was comfort in knowing what came next. She buckled Caleb into his car seat, while he happily sang the alphabet with several letters in the wrong order. She didn't correct him, not immediately. Some joys deserved to last a little longer. When they arrived, Patricia was already waiting on the porch with homemade blueberry muffins. My favorite boys are here. Caleb jumped into her arms. Muffins! Patricia laughed. I see you've inherited your mother's priorities. Jasmine smiled as she carried Caleb's backpack inside. You spoil him. I encourage him. There's a difference? Oh, absolutely. Patricia winked. Spoiling gives children everything they want. Encouragement gives them confidence to become who they're meant to be. Jasmine paused. She had never thought about it that way. One sentence. One quiet lesson. Another reminder that wisdom often lived inside ordinary conversations. At the hospital, Jasmine's morning began with an unexpected surprise. Karen Douglas handed her a small folder. Good news. Jasmine looked puzzled. What happened? The board approved the maternal support initiative. Her eyes widened. Already? Karen nodded. And, she smiled. They've asked if you'd consider serving as clinical coordinator. Jasmine blinked. I'm not sure I'm qualified. Karen laughed softly. I've noticed something. What? The most qualified people usually question whether they're qualified. She placed the folder in Jasmine's hands. Take it home. Think about it. No pressure. Jasmine thanked her before walking toward the break room. She sat quietly, staring at the folder. Clinical coordinator. It wasn't just a promotion. It was a chance to help shape how new mothers were cared for long after they left the delivery room. A few years ago, she would have declined immediately. She would have convinced herself someone else deserved it more. Now, she wasn't so sure. Growth often arrives disguised as opportunities that feel slightly too large. Meanwhile, Adrian stood outside the pediatric wing speaking with Sophia Bennett. Construction on the new Family Resource Center was scheduled to begin within a few months. Sophia smiled. The advisory council exceeded every expectation. Adrian nodded. They challenged several of our assumptions. Especially Jasmine. He smiled. Especially Jasmine. Sophia looked at him carefully. You trust her judgment. I do. You've known her for less than 2 months. He considered that. Time tells you how long you've known someone. He smiled. Character tells you how well. Sophia laughed. I suppose that's true. Then she grew thoughtful. You know, I've watched the two of you. Adrian looked surprised. We're just friends. I know. She smiled knowingly. But friendships built on respect usually make the strongest foundations. He didn't answer. Not because he disagreed, because the thought had quietly crossed his own mind. That afternoon, Jasmine found herself walking through the hospital courtyard during her lunch break. The spring flowers had begun blooming around the walking paths. Parents pushed strollers beneath flowering trees. Visitors sat on benches, enjoying the warm sunshine. She noticed Adrian sitting alone beneath an oak tree, reading a thick hardcover book. He hadn't seen her. Curious, she walked closer. "What are you reading?" He looked up and smiled. "A book on architecture." She laughed. "I was expecting something philosophical." "So was I." He closed the book. "But architecture reminds me that environments shape people." She sat on the opposite end of the bench. "How?" "Think about hospitals." He gestured toward the building. "Imagine 2 waiting rooms. One is cold. Grey walls. Fluorescent lights. Hard plastic chairs." She nodded. "The other has sunlight. Comfortable seating. Plants. A place for children to play." He looked at her. "Which room would help anxious families breathe a little easier?" "The second." "Exactly." He smiled. "Sometimes compassion isn't only expressed by people. It's also expressed through the spaces we create." Jasmine found herself looking around the courtyard differently. The flowers, the benches, the walking paths, the small fountain where children tossed pennies. She had walked through this courtyard dozens of times. Today, she noticed it. Perspective often changes before circumstances do. A comfortable silence settled between them. Finally, Jasmine asked, "Can I ask you something personal?" "You can. You've spent years helping other people." He nodded. "Who helped you?" Adrian leaned back against the bench. "My mother." He smiled softly. "And one teacher." "What did your teacher do?" "Nothing dramatic." He looked toward the fountain. "I was struggling after my father died. My grades dropped. I stopped talking much." He paused. "Most teachers tried encouraging me, but one simply started eating lunch in his classroom every Thursday." Jasmine listened carefully. "He never asked me to come. He just left the door open. And, eventually—" "You walked in." Adrian nodded. "For nearly 2 years." "What did you talk about?" He smiled. "Baseball. Books. History. Nothing related to grief." He looked at Jasmine. "He never forced me to explain my pain. He simply reminded me I wasn't carrying it alone." Jasmine's eyes softened. "Do you still know him?" "I do. I visit every Christmas." She smiled. "I think he'd be proud of you." Adrian looked down for a moment. "I hope so." Later that afternoon, as Jasmine prepared to leave the hospital, her phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. She answered cautiously. "Hello?" There was a brief pause. Then came a voice she hadn't expected to hear again. "Jasmine." It was Brandon. She closed her eyes briefly. "I know I shouldn't have called again." He sounded different, quieter. "I just wanted to ask if we could meet." She remained silent. "Not because I expect anything." He continued. "I owe you an apology." Jasmine looked out the hospital window. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Finally, she spoke calmly. "I'll think about it." "That's more than I deserve." He replied softly. When the call ended, she slipped the phone into her pocket without moving. Emily noticed immediately. "Everything okay?" Jasmine took a slow breath. "Someone from my past wants a conversation." Emily didn't ask who. She simply asked, "What does your piece need?" The question caught Jasmine off guard. Not, "What does he want?" Not, "What are you going to do?" Instead, "What does your piece need?" She smiled. "I don't know yet." Emily nodded. "Then don't rush the answer. Sometimes, the healthiest decisions are the ones made after our emotions have finished speaking." That evening, Adrian received an email from Sophia. Attached was the finalized proposal for the Maternal Wellness Initiative. She had also included one sentence in the message. "Every successful program begins with people who cared enough to listen before trying to lead." Adrian smiled. He thought about Jasmine, about the advisory council, about the countless conversations that had slowly reshaped his understanding of leadership. He realized something. Before meeting her, he believed helping people meant solving problems. Now, he understood that helping often began with understanding them. He closed his laptop and looked out across the Atlanta skyline. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. Somewhere beneath those lights, Jasmine was likely putting Caleb to bed, reading him a story, and trying to decide whether to open a door she had spent years keeping closed. Adrian silently hoped she would choose whatever protected her peace. Because caring about someone, he was beginning to learn, also meant respecting the decisions they needed time to make. Neither of them realized it. But the conversation Brandon had requested would soon test everything Jasmine believed about forgiveness. and everything Adrian believed about quietly standing beside someone without trying to control their choices. We've reached a turning point in Jasmine and Adrian's journey. Jasmine is finally rebuilding the life she thought she'd lost, while Adrian is discovering that true leadership begins with listening, not fixing. But now, the past has returned with one unexpected phone call, and the next decision Jasmine makes could change everything. Before we continue, if you're enjoying this story, please like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another heartfelt story filled with love, hope, and life-changing lessons. Now we'd love to hear from you. If someone abandoned you during the most painful moment of your life, but years later returned with a sincere apology, would you give them the chance to explain, or would you protect your peace and keep moving forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story or perspective may encourage someone who needs it today. Now let's continue into Chapter 6, where Jasmine finally comes face to face with the past she thought she had left behind, and discovers that healing isn't about forgetting, but about deciding what deserves a place in your future. Jasmine agreed to meet Brandon, not because she was considering giving him another chance, not because she missed him, and certainly not because she had forgotten what happened. She agreed because she no longer wanted unanswered questions occupying space in her mind. Sometimes closure doesn't come from the other person's explanation. Sometimes it comes from realizing you no longer need one. She chose a quiet cafe near Piedmont Park on a Saturday afternoon. It was bright, open, and comfortably public, not because she was afraid, because she wanted a place where she could leave whenever she chose. That decision mattered. Years earlier, Jasmine often organized her life around making other people comfortable. Now she had begun organizing it around healthy boundaries. There was a difference. Patricia noticed as Jasmine adjusted her coat before leaving. "You seem calm." "I am." "Nervous?" "A little." Patricia nodded. "Remember something." "What?" "You don't owe anyone access to the version of you they once hurt." Jasmine looked at her thoughtfully. "What do you mean?" "The woman sitting across from Brandon today isn't the same woman he walked away from." She smiled gently. "Don't let him speak to the old Jasmine while ignoring the woman you've become." Those words settled deeply into Jasmine's heart. Brandon was already waiting when she arrived. He stood as soon as he saw her. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. Time had changed him. The confidence that once bordered on arrogance had been replaced by something quieter, more uncertain. He looked older than 32. Not because of wrinkles, because regret has a way of aging people from the inside. "Thank you for coming." Jasmine sat down across from him. "I can't stay long." "I understand." A server brought menus. Neither of them opened them. Finally, Brandon spoke. "I've rehearsed this conversation 100 times. Jasmine remained silent, and every version sounded selfish. She waited. "So, I'll just tell you the truth." He took a slow breath. "The day Caleb was born, I was terrified." Jasmine's expression didn't change. "I convinced myself that leaving for a little while would help me think." His voice cracked slightly. "But I kept driving." He lowered his eyes. "Then shame convinced me it was too late to come back." Silence stretched between them. The cafe buzzed softly around them, but neither noticed. Brandon continued. "I spent months telling myself you'd hate me." "You were right," Jasmine answered quietly. He nodded. "I know." She looked at him carefully. "I need you to understand something." "I'm listening." "You didn't leave because you were scared." He frowned slightly. "Everyone is scared." She continued calmly. "You left because, in that moment, you chose your fear over your responsibility." Brandon closed his eyes briefly. She wasn't trying to punish him. She was simply telling the truth. And sometimes the truth carries more weight when it's spoken without anger. "I've spent 2 years wondering how to apologize," he whispered. Jasmine looked at him steadily. "I don't need a perfect apology." "You don't?" "No." She folded her hands. "I needed a dependable partner." His shoulders dropped. The sentence landed harder than raised voices ever could. Across the city, Adrian spent the afternoon helping his mother organize donated books for a community literacy program. Margaret noticed he seemed distracted. "You're worried." "A little." "About Jasmine?" He smiled. "You've become very good at this." A mother notices patterns. She placed another book into a box. "Is she all right?" "I think so." "But she's meeting someone from her past today." Margaret looked up. "The child's father?" Adrian nodded. She remained thoughtful for several moments. Then she asked, "What do you hope happens?" Adrian considered the question carefully. Finally he answered, "I hope she leaves believing whatever choice she makes was truly her own." Margaret smiled warmly. "Good." He looked surprised. You don't think I should hope she'll choose me? She laughed softly. Adrian. If someone has to lose their freedom before they can choose you, Zach, they're not really choosing you. He smiled slowly. I suppose that's true. No, she corrected gently. It's essential. She looked toward the stacks of children's books surrounding them. The healthiest love never competes with someone's healing. It protects it. Adrian quietly carried those words with him. Back at the cafe, Brandon reached into his jacket pocket. I brought something. He carefully placed a small envelope on the table. Jasmine looked at it without touching it. What is it? Letters, she frowned. I wrote one every month. For Caleb. Her eyes widened slightly. I never mailed them. I didn't think I had the right. Jasmine slowly opened the envelope. Inside were dozens of neatly folded letters, each dated, each addressed to Caleb. She unfolded the first one. Today, you would have been 3 months old. Another, I hope someday you like baseball. Another, I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough to become the father you deserved. She quietly placed them back inside the envelope. Emotion filled her eyes. Not because the letters erased anything. They didn't. But because they revealed something she hadn't expected. Regret. Real regret. Brandon watched her carefully. I know words don't change the past. They don't. She agreed. I just wanted you to know. He swallowed. I never stopped thinking about him. Jasmine nodded slowly. I believe you. Hope flickered across Brandon's face. Then she continued. But thinking about someone. And showing up for them. Are not the same thing. His hope quietly settled into understanding. She wasn't rejecting his humanity. She was acknowledging reality. There is a profound difference. After leaving the cafe, Jasmine drove to Piedmont Park instead of going straight home. She needed time. Not because she was confused, because she wanted to separate emotion from decision. She sat on a bench while Caleb chased pigeons across the grass with Patricia nearby. The afternoon sun filtered gently through towering oak trees. Families laughed. Cyclists passed along winding trails. Life continued, exactly as it always had. She looked down at the envelope resting beside her. The letters represented something important. Not reconciliation, responsibility, late responsibility, but responsibility nonetheless. Patricia sat beside her. How are you? Jasmine smiled faintly. I expected to feel angry. And I mostly feel sad. For him? For all of us. She looked toward Caleb. So much time was lost. Patricia nodded. Grief isn't only about what happened. She spoke softly. It's also about what never had the chance to happen. Jasmine watched Caleb laugh as a little girl joined his game. Children made friends in seconds. Adults often needed years. I don't know what to do next. Patricia gently covered Jasmine's hand with her own. You don't have to decide what Brandon deserves today. She smiled warmly. You only need to decide what Caleb deserves. That question changed everything. Jasmine had spent the entire afternoon thinking about herself, her pain, her forgiveness, her memories. Now, the focus shifted, not to the past, to Caleb's future. Sometimes wisdom doesn't give us the answer. It simply asks the better question. As the sun slowly began to set over the park, Jasmine looked at her son running freely across the grass. For the first time since Brandon's phone call, her heart felt unexpectedly peaceful. Not because everything had been resolved, but because she finally understood where her decision needed to begin. Not with yesterday, with the little boy laughing in front of her. Jasmine barely slept that night, not because Brandon's words haunted her. They didn't. What stayed with her was Patricia's question. What does Caleb deserve? She replayed it over and over as she lay awake, listening to the gentle rhythm of rain against her bedroom window. For so long, every difficult decision had been filtered through the lens of her own pain. Did she deserve an apology? Did she deserve justice? Did she deserve an explanation? Those questions were understandable. But motherhood had quietly changed the center of her life. Now another question mattered more. What kind of environment would help Caleb grow into a healthy, emotionally secure young man? She realized something she hadn't fully understood before. Children don't only learn from what adults tell them. They learn from what adults tolerate. They learn from the apologies they accept, the boundaries they keep, the respect they require. Before falling asleep, Jasmine made one decision. She wouldn't let guilt make the next choice. Neither Brandon's guilt, nor her own. The following morning, Adrian arrived early at the Whitmore Foundation. His assistant found him standing beside the large windows overlooking downtown Atlanta. You've been here since 6. He smiled. I couldn't sleep. She handed him his coffee. Everything all right? I think so. She looked at him curiously. That doesn't sound convincing. Adrian laughed softly. I'm learning something. What's that? Sometimes caring about someone means accepting that you're not the person who gets to solve their problem. His assistant smiled knowingly. That's not an easy lesson. No, it isn't. After she left, Adrian looked at the framed photograph on his desk. It showed him and his mother several years earlier, during the opening of one of the Foundation's community centers. His mother had insisted on standing behind the volunteers instead of in front of them. When reporters asked why, she had answered with words he never forgot. Real service isn't about being seen. It's about making sure other people feel seen. Those words had shaped his entire philosophy of leadership. Now, they were shaping something else. The way he cared for Jasmine. He wasn't waiting for her to choose him. He was simply hoping she found peace. If that peace eventually included him, wonderful. If it didn't, he still wanted her to have it. That realization surprised him. Perhaps this was what mature love looked like. Not possession, not urgency. Simply wanting the best for another person. On Monday afternoon, Jasmine received another message from Brandon. This time, it wasn't a voicemail. It was a text. Thank you for listening. I know I have no right to ask for anything else, but if you ever believe Caleb should know me, I'll spend the rest of my life earning that privilege. She read it twice, then placed the phone in her purse without replying. Not because she was ignoring him, because she believed important conversations deserved more than quick messages. Some things were too significant for a text. That evening, the advisory council met again. The atmosphere felt lighter than usual. The team had reached the final stage of designing the maternal wellness program. Colorful floor plans covered the tables, support group schedules, volunteer training manuals, resource guides for new parents. Jasmine looked around the room with quiet pride. A few months ago, these ideas had existed only as conversations. Now, they were becoming something real. Sophia stood at the front of the room. I'd like everyone to see something. She projected 2 photographs onto the screen. The first showed an empty hospital room from several months earlier. The second displayed the newly renovated family support center. Comfortable chairs, warm lighting, a children's play area, private counseling rooms, a small library, fresh flowers, natural sunlight. The difference was remarkable. Sophia smiled. These changes happened because people around this table refused to assume they already knew what families needed. Everyone applauded. Then she turned toward Jasmine. And one suggestion changed the entire project. Jasmine looked surprised. Sophia continued. The phrase, "How are you becoming?" She smiled warmly. We've decided to include that question in every postpartum follow-up appointment. The room grew quiet. Jasmine blinked in surprise. Really? Dr. Rebecca Collins nodded. It reminds our staff that mothers aren't simply recovering physically. They're becoming someone new. Jasmine looked down at the notebook in front of her. She had written those words almost absent-mindedly. Now they would become part of thousands of conversations. It reminded her of something important. Never underestimate the impact of one honest thought shared at the right time. After the meeting, Adrian caught up with her outside. Congratulations, she smiled. For what? You've changed how this hospital cares for people. She shook her head. We all did. He smiled. I know, but you reminded us to ask a better question. They began walking toward the parking garage. Jasmine hesitated before speaking. I met Caleb's father. Adrian looked at her. There was no surprise in his expression, only quiet attention. How did it go? She appreciated that he didn't ask if it went well. He simply asked how it went. It was honest. He nodded gently. I think he regrets what he did. And how do you feel? She looked ahead instead of answering immediately. I realized something. What? I've spent 2 years trying to decide whether Brandon deserved forgiveness. She smiled faintly. But forgiveness isn't actually the hardest part. What is? Trust. She stopped walking for a moment. I can forgive someone without pretending the trust they broke magically repaired itself. Adrian nodded slowly. I think that's very wise. She looked at him. Do you? I do. He smiled gently. Forgiveness releases the weight you carry. He paused. Trust is something another person has to rebuild. Jasmine stared at him for a second. You always seem to know exactly what to say. He laughed. I promise you. I don't. I simply try to say what's true. They resumed walking. For several moments, neither spoke. Then Adrian smiled. My mother once told me something. What? People often confuse forgiveness with returning everything to the way it was. He looked at Jasmine. Healthy relationships don't move backward. They move forward honestly, or they don't move at all. Jasmine smiled. I'd like to meet your mother someday. I think she'd like that. Neither realized how naturally the conversation had flowed. There were no awkward pauses, no attempts to impress one another. A week later, Jasmine invited Brandon to meet at a neighborhood park. This time, Caleb was with her. Brandon arrived early. He stood nervously beside a bench, his hands shoved into his pockets. When he saw the little boy running toward the playground, his eyes immediately filled with tears. So, whoa, he whispered. That's him. Jasmine nodded. That's Caleb. Brandon watched quietly as the little boy climbed a small slide with determined concentration. He looks happy. He is. I'm glad. His voice broke. I missed so much. Jasmine didn't argue. He had. There was no point pretending otherwise. After several minutes, Brandon looked at her. I don't expect him to call me Dad. I haven't earned that. She appreciated the honesty. What I hope, he continued softly, is that one day he might know who I am. Jasmine folded her hands. I can't promise what that relationship will look like. I understand. But I can promise this. He listened carefully. Every decision I make will begin with one question. What question? She smiled gently. Is this good for Caleb? Brandon nodded. It should. For the first time since they met again, neither of them felt the need to defend themselves. The conversation wasn't about rewriting history. It was about protecting the future. As Caleb ran back toward them holding a dandelion almost as tall as his arm, Jasmine realized something. Healing doesn't always end with reconciliation. Sometimes, it ends with clarity, and clarity gives us the courage to build healthier tomorrows than we ever had yesterday. Autumn arrived almost unnoticed. The trees lining the streets of Atlanta slowly exchanged their deep green leaves for shades of amber and gold, while cool morning air replaced the heavy warmth of summer. Life, Jasmine realized, rarely announced its seasons. People simply woke up one day and noticed something had changed. She felt that way about herself. The woman who once dreaded walking into street. Anne's medical center now looked forward to every shift. The hospital no longer reminded her only of the day Caleb was born. It reminded her of frightened mothers she had encouraged, of newborns taking their first breaths, of families discovering hope after difficult nights, and of the unexpected friendship that had quietly become one of the safest parts of her life. Healing, she had learned, wasn't replacing painful memories. It was creating enough beautiful ones that the painful memories no longer stood alone. One Thursday morning, Jasmine arrived early for work. The maternity ward was unusually quiet. Only 2 patients had been admitted overnight, giving the staff a rare opportunity to enjoy an unhurried cup of coffee together. Emily slid into the chair beside her. You've changed. Jasmine smiled over the rim of her mug. I hope that's a compliment. It is. Emily leaned back. You laugh more. You smile without forcing it. And? She grinned. You've stopped apologizing for things that aren't your fault. Jasmine laughed. I used to do that a lot, didn't I? You apologized when someone else bumped into you. Both women laughed. Jasmine thought about it for a moment. I think I spent years believing I had to keep everyone happy. Emily nodded knowingly. And now? I've realized something. What? Being kind doesn't require abandoning yourself. Emily raised her coffee cup. Now that's worth celebrating. Jasmine clinked her mug gently against Emily's. It was a small moment, one that most people would have forgotten before lunchtime. But Jasmine knew better now. Life wasn't changed only by extraordinary events. Sometimes it was changed by finally recognizing how much you had grown. Across the city, Adrian stood in the nearly completed Family Resource Center. Construction crews were installing bookshelves, while volunteers unpacked boxes of children's toys. The once empty space now felt warm and welcoming. Natural light poured through large windows. Soft-colored walls replaced the sterile grey paint that had once covered every surface. There were comfortable chairs arranged in circles rather than rows. A reading corner, a play area, private counseling rooms. Every detail had been chosen intentionally. Sophia walked beside him. You were right. About what? People don't just need services. She looked around the room. They need spaces that tell them they're welcome. Adrian smiled. I wasn't the one who taught us that. She laughed. No. You listened to the people who did. As they reached the entrance, a framed plaque caught Adrian's attention. It displayed the guiding principle of the center. Every family deserves to feel seen, heard, and supported. Below it appeared a smaller line. inspired by the voices of parents, nurses, and caregivers who shared their stories with courage. No individual names, no recognition for executives, no spotlight, just shared purpose. Adrian smiled. That felt exactly right. Saturday morning brought something Jasmine had quietly anticipated. Brandon's first supervised visit with Caleb. She chose a children's science museum because it offered open spaces, plenty of activities, and little pressure for conversation. Brandon arrived carrying nothing except a nervous smile. I wasn't sure if I should bring a gift. Jasmine appreciated that. I'm glad you didn't. He looked surprised. I'd rather he gets to know you. She smiled gently. Not your presence. Brandon nodded. I understand. Caleb looked up curiously. Mama? Is Brandon. She kept her explanation simple. He's someone who's happy to spend today with us. Caleb offered a shy wave. Brandon smiled through moist eyes. Hi, buddy. Children have an extraordinary ability to meet the present moment without carrying the emotional weight adults attach to it. Within 20 minutes, Caleb was proudly showing Brandon how to build a bridge from oversized foam blocks. Dinosaur goes here, he declared confidently. Brandon laughed. I think that's an excellent engineering decision. Jasmine watched quietly from a nearby bench. She didn't interfere. She didn't force closeness. She simply allowed the moment to become whatever it naturally was. That, she realized, was another lesson in healthy relationships. Not every connection needs to be rushed. Some deserve room to grow at their own pace. Later that afternoon, Adrian stopped by his mother's house carrying groceries. Margaret looked amused. You know I can still shop for myself. I know. He placed the bags on the kitchen counter. But I enjoy helping. She smiled knowingly. You've inherited my father's habit. What habit? Finding excuses to spend time with people you love. Adrian laughed. I suppose that's true. As they prepared lunch together, Margaret glanced at him. You've been very patient. He looked up. With Jasmine. He smiled softly. I think she's worth being patient for. Margaret nodded approvingly. What if she never feels the same? He stirred the soup quietly before answering. Then, I'll still be grateful I met her. His mother stopped chopping vegetables. She looked at him with unmistakable pride. Do you know why that answer makes me happy? He shook his head. Because it tells me you're not trying to fill a hole in your own life. She smiled warmly. You're simply appreciating another person's place in it. Adrian reflected on her words. There had been a time when loneliness tempted him to seek companionship, simply to avoid being alone. Now, his feelings for Jasmine came from a very different place. He admired her, respected her, trusted her. Whether those feelings grew into love wasn't something he wanted to force. Some of the best things in life couldn't be hurried. Monday afternoon brought unexpected news. The hospital board officially announced the opening date for the new Family Resource Center. Staff gathered in the auditorium to celebrate. Karen stepped onto the stage. This center exists because many people chose to listen before leading. She smiled toward the audience. I'd like to recognize someone whose insight shaped much of this project. Jasmine looked around, assuming Karen meant Adrian. Instead, Karen called her name. For a moment, Jasmine simply stared. Emily nudged her gently. Go. Embarrassed, Jasmine walked to the stage. Karen handed her a framed certificate, then quietly whispered, This isn't for surviving. It's for serving. The words caught Jasmine completely off guard. For years, nearly every compliment she received centered on how much she had endured. Strong, resilient, inspiring. Today, someone recognized the contribution she was making now, not the pain she had survived yesterday. As applause filled the auditorium, Jasmine spotted Adrian standing near the back. He wasn't clapping the loudest. He wasn't trying to attract attention. He simply smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone taking credit. It was the smile of someone genuinely happy to watch another person receive the recognition they deserved. And somehow, that meant more to Jasmine than she could explain. That evening, as everyone slowly left the auditorium, Jasmine stepped outside into the cool autumn air. She found Adrian standing beneath the large oak tree near the hospital entrance. He turned as she approached. Congratulations. She smiled. Thank you. He looked at the certificate in her hands. You earned that. I wasn't expecting it. The best recognition usually arrives that way. She laughed softly. You always seem to know the right thing to say. He smiled. No. I've just had good teachers. They stood quietly for a moment, watching golden leaves drift across the sidewalk. Finally, Jasmine spoke. You know, I used to think my story would always be about the day someone left. She looked toward the hospital windows glowing against the evening sky. I don't think that anymore. Adrian waited. She smiled gently. I think my story has become about all the people who stayed. The words settled softly between them. Neither realized it then. But something had quietly changed. For the first time, neither of them was simply healing from the past. They were beginning to imagine a future. The following week unfolded with the quiet rhythm both Jasmine and Adrian had come to appreciate. There were no dramatic surprises, no life-altering announcements, just ordinary days, stitched together by meaningful moments. Jasmine had learned that peace rarely arrived all at once. It accumulated. One healthy decision. One honest conversation. One ordinary morning at a time. She was finishing paperwork when Olivia Martinez, the young mother she had cared for during her first week back at the hospital, appeared at the nurse's station carrying a sleeping baby wrapped in a soft yellow blanket. "Jasmine?" Jasmine looked up, immediately recognizing her. "Olivia!" The younger woman smiled brightly. "I wanted you to meet someone." She gently pulled back the blanket. "This is Hannah." Jasmine leaned closer. The baby slept peacefully, one tiny hand resting against her cheek. "She's beautiful." Olivia laughed. "I think so too." For a moment, they simply admired the baby. Then Olivia grew unexpectedly emotional. "I almost didn't come today." Jasmine looked at her with concern. "Is everything all right?" Olivia nodded. "Yes." She took a slow breath. "I just wanted to tell you something." Jasmine waited. "The day I was admitted. I told you I was terrified." "I remember. You said something I've thought about almost every day since." Jasmine searched her memory. "What did I say?" Olivia smiled. "You told me that loving parents aren't perfect. They're willing to keep learning." She looked down at Hannah. "Whenever I think I'm failing." I remember those words. Jasmine felt her throat tighten. She had spoken that sentence almost casually. She hadn't imagined someone would carry it home. Olivia smiled. "You probably don't remember half the people you've encouraged. But I promise they remember you." After Olivia left, Jasmine remained standing in the hallway for several moments. She thought about how often people underestimated the power of ordinary kindness. A few thoughtful words, spoken at the right time, could become part of someone else's inner voice for years. Perhaps that was one of life's greatest responsibilities, to become the kind of person whose words helped others stand a little taller. That afternoon, Adrian visited the nearly completed Family Resource Center for a final inspection. Construction workers were putting the finishing touches on the building. Children's books lined freshly painted shelves. Comfortable rocking chairs filled the counseling rooms. Artwork created by local elementary school students decorated the walls. As he walked through the building, he noticed something taped to one of the doors. It wasn't part of the official design. It was a handwritten note left by one of the volunteers. "May every family who enters here leave believing tomorrow can be better than today." Adrian smiled. He carefully removed the note before folding it into his wallet. Sophia noticed. "Keeping that?" "I am." "Why?" He looked around the room. "Because buildings aren't remembered for their walls." He smiled softly. "They're remembered for what people experience inside them." Sophia nodded. "That's probably why this place already feels different." Later that evening, Adrian received an unexpected phone call. It was Daniel Reynolds. "You busy?" "Not particularly. I'd like your opinion on something." An hour later, they met at a quiet neighborhood restaurant. After ordering dinner, Daniel looked unusually serious. "Can I ask you a personal question?" Adrian smiled. "When have you ever waited for permission?" Daniel laughed. "Fair enough." He became thoughtful. "Are you falling in love with Jasmine?" The question lingered between them. Adrian didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked through the restaurant window where an elderly couple slowly crossed the street, hand in hand. Finally, he spoke. "I think." He paused. "I stopped asking myself that question." Daniel looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "I've spent more time asking whether I bring peace into her life. And then, wondering what I hope to receive from her." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "I've known you for 20 years. And? I don't think I've ever heard you describe love that way." Adrian smiled. "I don't think I understood it this way before." Daniel nodded quietly. There was a maturity in Adrian's words that hadn't been there a few years earlier. Love wasn't becoming something he wanted to possess. It was becoming someone he wanted to practice. On Friday evening, the advisory council gathered for one final planning dinner before the Family Resource Center officially opened. Unlike previous meetings, there were no agendas, no presentations, just conversation. People talked about their families, favorite books, childhood memories, dreams for the future. At one point, Sophia smiled across the table. I have a question. Everyone looked toward her. If you could thank one person who changed your life, who would it be? The answers came one after another. A grandfather, a teacher, a neighbor, a college roommate. When it became Jasmine's turn, she looked down at her glass for a moment. My Aunt Patricia. Several people smiled. She continued. When my parents died, she never tried to replace them. She simply loved me faithfully. She smiled warmly. She taught me that consistency is one of the purest forms of love. The room grew quiet. Adrian found himself reflecting on those words. Consistency. Not grand gestures. Not dramatic promises. Just showing up. Again, and again, and again. When his turn came, he smiled. My mother. Everyone nodded knowingly. But, he added, I'd also thank a nurse whose name I never learned. He briefly shared the story of the woman who quietly cared for his grieving mother years ago. I've spent most of my adult life trying to honor a kindness from someone who probably never knew how much it mattered. Jasmine smiled across the table. I think she'd be proud. I hope so. Their eyes met for only a moment. Neither looked away awkwardly. Neither felt the need to hide the warmth growing between them. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't overwhelming. It simply felt safe. After dinner, everyone lingered outside beneath strings of lights decorating the hospital courtyard. One by one, people said their goodbyes. Soon, only Jasmine and Adrian remained. They began walking slowly through the garden paths. I've been thinking. Jasmine smiled. I've noticed that's one of your favorite hobbies. He laughed. It probably is. What have you been thinking about? The first day we met. She looked at him curiously. The balloon? He nodded. I realized something recently. What? If Caleb hadn't chased that balloon, our lives might never have crossed. Jasmine smiled. I've thought about that too. They reached the small fountain in the center of the courtyard. The water reflected the soft evening lights. Jasmine looked at the ripples before speaking. For a long time, I kept asking why the hardest things happened to me. She took a slow breath. I don't ask that anymore. What do you ask now? She smiled gently. I ask what those experiences have taught me. And what have they taught you? She looked at him. They taught me the difference between someone who promises to stay, and someone who quietly does. Adrian's heart skipped, not because the words were romantic, because they were deeply honest. He looked at her with quiet sincerity. I'm glad our paths crossed, Jasmine. She smiled. So am I. Neither reached for the other's hand. Neither tried to define what was growing between them. They simply stood together beneath the autumn sky, comfortable in the silence. Because neither of them needed certainty to appreciate the present. Some relationships become stronger not by rushing toward the future, but by giving trust enough time to become unmistakable. As they finally walked toward their cars, both carried the same quiet realization. The past was no longer the loudest voice in their lives. Hope was. The Family Resource Center officially opened on the first Saturday of October. By 8 o'clock that morning, the courtyard outside Street Anne's medical center was already filled with families. Parents pushed strollers beneath rows of white tents. Children laughed as they painted pumpkins at a craft table set up by volunteers. Local musicians played soft acoustic music near the entrance, giving the celebration the warmth of a neighborhood gathering rather than a formal ceremony. Jasmine stood near the front doors with Emily, watching the families arrive. It's beautiful. Emily smiled. It feels different from most hospital events. Jasmine nodded. That's because it doesn't feel like a hospital. She looked around. It feels like hope. A few feet away, volunteers greeted every family by name, instead of handing out numbered registration cards. No one hurried anyone. No one spoke in rehearsed corporate language. People simply welcomed one another. Jasmine couldn't help smiling. Months earlier, this had been nothing more than a conversation around a table. Now, children were laughing in a place that hadn't even existed. Sometimes the greatest proof that ideas matter is seeing them become real enough for someone else's life to change. Inside the lobby, Adrian quietly adjusted a display of children's books that had shifted slightly overnight. One of the volunteers laughed. You know, someone else can do that. I know. He straightened one final book. But if I notice something small that can make people feel more welcome. He smiled. I'd rather fix it than walk past it. The volunteer shook her head. You're not much like the billionaires people see in movies. Adrian laughed. My mother says real life is usually more interesting than movies. She smiled. I think she's right. As he stepped back, he noticed a little girl carefully examining the books. She couldn't have been older than 6. Can I help you find something? She looked up shyly. I'm looking for dinosaur stories. Adrian smiled. I think we can solve that. Together, they searched the shelf until they found exactly what she wanted. The little girl hugged the book tightly. Thank you. You're welcome. Her mother watched the interaction from a few feet away. I didn't realize, she said softly, that you were Mr. Whitmore. Adrian smiled politely. I'm Adrian. She nodded. Thank you. For what? She looked around the center. My husband lost his job last year. We've been struggling. She glanced toward the counseling rooms. I never imagined we'd find something like this. Adrian shook his head gently. You don't need to thank me. She looked confused. Why not? Because this place belongs to every family who walks through those doors. He smiled. We're simply taking care of it together. As she walked away, Sophia approached him. I saw that. Saw what? The conversation. She smiled knowingly. You have a gift. Adrian looked puzzled. For organizing books? For making people feel like they belong. Meanwhile, Jasmine helped guide visitors through the new building. A young mother stopped beside one of the resource boards. Tears quietly filled her eyes. Is everything all right? Jasmine asked gently. The woman nodded. My twins were born 6 weeks early. She looked around. I felt so alone. Jasmine walked beside her. You aren't anymore. The woman looked surprised. There are support groups every Tuesday. Jasmine pointed toward another room. Peer mentors. Parenting workshops. A quiet room, if you simply need somewhere to breathe. The woman smiled through tears. I wish this had existed months ago. Jasmine squeezed her hand. It exists now. And someone else will need it tomorrow. The woman nodded. I hadn't thought about it that way. Jasmine smiled. Our hardest seasons sometimes become someone else's easier beginning. The woman looked around the center once more. I think that's beautiful. The opening ceremony began just before noon. Hospital staff, community leaders, volunteers, families, everyone gathered beneath the large oak trees outside the entrance. Karen Douglas welcomed everyone before inviting Adrian to speak. He walked to the podium carrying only a few handwritten notes. He looked at the crowd for a long moment, then quietly folded the notes and placed them in his pocket. I don't think I need these. Laughter rippled through the audience. He smiled. When we first discussed creating this center, we thought we were building a resource. He glanced toward the building behind him. We were wrong. The audience listened attentively. We were building a reminder. A reminder that asking for help isn't weakness. A reminder that parents deserve support, not judgment. A reminder that no one should feel invisible during one of the most important seasons of their life. He paused. And most importantly, he smiled. A reminder that communities become stronger every time ordinary people decide to care for one another. The applause was warm and heartfelt. Then, Adrian surprised everyone. There are several people I'd like to thank. He mentioned the architects, construction crews, volunteers, hospital staff. Then he looked toward Jasmine. One person reminded all of us that the question isn't simply, how are you doing? Trademark. He smiled warmly. It's, how are you becoming? The audience applauded again. Jasmine felt her face grow warm. She wasn't embarrassed. She was humbled. No one had ever publicly credited her ideas before. After the applause settled, Adrian continued. I hope every family who walks into this building leaves believing something important. He looked across the crowd. You don't have to carry difficult seasons by yourself. Those words lingered long after he stepped away from the podium. Following the ceremony, guests explored the center. Children filled the reading corner. Counselors welcomed new parents. Volunteers served lunch. The building quickly became exactly what everyone had hoped. Not impressive, comforting. As Jasmine walked through the hallway, she heard someone call her name. She turned. Standing near the entrance was Brandon. She hadn't expected him. He looked uncomfortable. I hope it's okay that I came. She looked surprised. It is. He glanced around the building. I heard about the opening. I wanted to see it. He smiled faintly. You helped build this. Jasmine shook her head. A lot of people did. He nodded. I know, but I wanted to tell you something. She waited patiently. I've been attending counseling. Her expression softened. For several months. I'm glad. I should have done it years ago. He looked down briefly. I spent a long time blaming fear. He sighed. My counselor helped me realize something. What? I wasn't running from fatherhood. I was running from myself. Jasmine listened quietly. I grew up believing failure made people unlovable. He smiled sadly. So, when I became afraid I'd fail as a father, I convinced myself leaving would hurt less than staying. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She understood something important. Understanding someone's pain isn't the same as excusing the choices they made because of it. Both truths could exist together. Brandon looked at her. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. I just wanted you to know. I'm finally trying to become someone Caleb can respect. Jasmine smiled gently. I hope you do. He nodded. So do I. As Brandon walked away, Jasmine felt something unexpected. Not relief, not sadness, gratitude, not for what had happened, but for who she had become, because she refused to let what happened define the rest of her life. Across the courtyard, Adrian had noticed the conversation from a distance. He didn't walk over. He didn't interrupt. He simply continued helping visitors. Sophia quietly joined him. You saw? He nodded. You didn't go over. He smiled. It wasn't my conversation. She looked at him thoughtfully. That takes restraint. Adrian glanced toward Jasmine, who was now helping a young family find the counseling rooms. Caring about someone, he said softly, also means trusting them to handle the conversations that belong to them. Sophia smiled. I think you've learned that lesson well. He looked toward the entrance of the Family Resource Center, where families continued streaming through the doors with hopeful smiles. So has she. As the afternoon sun bathed the courtyard in warm golden light, Adrian realized something he hadn't expected. He wasn't proud because the center had opened successfully. He was proud because the people who had built it were becoming exactly the kind of community they had hoped to create. And perhaps that was the greatest success of all. Chapter 8, Part 2. The Memory Worth Keeping. The celebration lasted well into the afternoon. Children moved from one activity to another with endless energy, their laughter echoing through the courtyard. Parents gathered around picnic tables, many of them meeting one another for the first time. Volunteers carried trays of sandwiches and fruit, while counselors introduced themselves to families who had already signed up for support groups. The Family Resource Center no longer felt like a new building. It already felt lived in. Jasmine stood near the reading corner, watching a young mother smile as another parent offered to hold her baby so she could eat with both hands for the first time all day. The exchange lasted less than a minute. No speeches, no introductions, just one tired parent helping another. Jasmine smiled to herself. This was exactly what they had hoped for. Support didn't always begin with professionals. Sometimes it began with someone saying, I've been where you are. Near the entrance, Caleb was determined to explore every inch of the building. Mama! He ran toward her carrying a paper crown decorated with crayons and glitter. Look! She knelt to admire it. I think that's the fanciest crown I've ever seen. He grinned proudly. I'm a king. You certainly are. He placed the crown carefully on her head instead. No. He shook his head with complete seriousness. You're the queen. Several volunteers nearby laughed softly. Jasmine laughed too, but her eyes grew unexpectedly misty. Children had a way of expressing love without hesitation. No conditions. No expectations. Just sincerity. She hugged Caleb tightly. Thank you. He smiled. I love you. I love you more. No. He giggled. I love you bigger. She laughed. I don't think anyone can argue with that. Across the room, Adrian happened to witness the exchange. He looked away after a moment, giving them their privacy. Yet something about that simple interaction stayed with him. Love wasn't measured by expensive gifts or impressive words. Sometimes it looked like a paper crown made by small hands. As the afternoon slowed, Patricia arrived carrying a homemade peach cobbler for the volunteers. Emily spotted her immediately. You must be Patricia. Patricia smiled. And you must be Emily. I've heard so much about you. I hope only the good things. Emily laughed. Nothing but. Jasmine walked over and embraced her aunt. You came. I wouldn't miss today. Patricia looked around the center with admiration. You helped create something beautiful. Jasmine gently shook her head. We all did. Patricia looked at her niece thoughtfully. You know, when you first came to live with me after your parents passed away, you used to ask me why painful things happened. Jasmine remembered. You haven't asked that question in a very long time. Jasmine looked around at the families filling the center. No. She smiled softly. I've been too busy asking what love looks like after pain. Patricia gently squeezed her hand. And what have you discovered? Jasmine watched Caleb helping another little boy stack toy blocks. I've discovered. That love isn't the absence of pain. It's the presence of people who keep showing up. Patricia smiled. I think you've learned the lesson your mother hoped you'd one day understand. Later that afternoon, Adrian found himself sitting alone in the small garden behind the resource center. The celebration was still going on inside, but he welcomed a few quiet moments. He removed the folded volunteer's note from his wallet and read it again. May every family who enters here leave believing tomorrow can be better than today. Footsteps approached. Margaret sat beside him without saying anything. You disappeared. He smiled. I needed 5 minutes. She looked toward the garden flowers, swaying gently in the breeze. You've always come outside when you're thinking. I didn't realize it was that obvious. To me, it is. They sat quietly before she asked, Are you happy? Adrian answered without hesitation. Yes. She smiled. Because the center opened? He thought for a moment. Partly. And? He looked toward the building where Jasmine was laughing with several families. I've spent years believing meaningful work was the greatest gift I could offer the world. Margaret nodded. It is meaningful. It is. He smiled. But I've realized something. What? Meaningful work becomes even richer when there are meaningful people to share it with. His mother followed his gaze. You care for her? I do. She looked at him kindly. Then don't be afraid of that. I'm not. He smiled. I'm just determined not to rush it. Margaret laughed softly. I've noticed. As the event came to an end, volunteers gathered to help clean up. Without being asked, Adrian rolled up his sleeves and began folding tables. Several volunteers looked surprised. One young man approached him. Mr. Whitmore, you don't have to do that. Adrian smiled. Neither do you. The young man laughed. I suppose that's true. Then let's both keep helping. Jasmine noticed from across the courtyard. She watched as Adrian worked beside volunteers who had no idea he owned companies worth billions of dollars. No photographers surrounded him. No reporters. No announcements. Just quiet service. She remembered something Brandon had once told her years ago. If I ever become successful, I'll never have to do ordinary things again. At the time, she'd admired the ambition. Now she understood how differently two people could define success. One believed success freed you from serving. The other believed success gave you more opportunities to serve. That difference said everything. As the sun began to set, the last families slowly headed home. The courtyard grew peaceful again. Jasmine found Adrian carrying the final box of supplies toward the storage room. Need a hand? I won't say no. Together they carried the box inside. When they finished, they remained standing in the quiet hallway. For a few seconds, neither spoke. Finally, Adrian broke the silence. Do you know what my favorite part of today was? She smiled. The speeches? He laughed. Definitely not. The ribbon cutting? No. She thought for a moment. The little girl who found the dinosaur book? That was a good moment. He smiled. But not my favorite. What was? He looked at her. The moment I realized nobody was talking about who paid for the building. She looked slightly puzzled. They were talking about how welcome they felt. Jasmine smiled slowly. I noticed that too. He leaned lightly against the wall. I think that's how it should be. So do I. She hesitated before speaking again. Can I tell you something? Always. I've been thinking about memories. He smiled. You've got my attention. For years. Well, I believed the memory that would define my life was the day Caleb was born. Her voice softened. Not because of his birth, but because of what happened. She looked around the resource center. Today. I realized something. What? I don't remember that day first anymore. He remained quiet. She continued. When I think about hospitals now, I think about this place. I think about families helping one another. I think about second chances. She smiled. I think about hope. Adrian looked at her with quiet admiration. That's a beautiful kind of healing. She nodded gently. It surprised me. He smiled. The best kinds usually do. Just then, Caleb came running down the hallway holding a camera a volunteer had used throughout the event. Mama, I found pictures. The volunteer laughed. They're all printed already. Caleb handed one to Jasmine. She looked down. It captured an ordinary moment. She was kneeling beside a frightened young mother, smiling gently while helping her hold her newborn baby. Neither Jasmine nor the mother had noticed the camera. Adrian looked at the photograph. You weren't looking at the camera. She smiled. I didn't know it was there. I know. He pointed to the picture. That's why I like it. She looked curious. Why? Because it captured who you are. instead of who you thought people wanted you to be. Jasmine stared at the photograph for a long moment, then carefully placed it inside her bag. Some photographs preserve faces, others preserve seasons of our lives. She had a feeling this one would become the kind she kept for many years. As they stepped outside together, the evening sky glowed with streaks of orange and purple. Neither of them realized that another season of life was quietly approaching. One that would ask them both a question neither had expected. What happens when friendship becomes something deeper, and both people are afraid of risking the peace they've worked so hard to find? 2 weeks passed after the opening of the Family Resource Center. Life settled back into its familiar rhythm. Jasmine worked her hospital shifts. Caleb continued discovering the world with endless curiosity. Adrian divided his time between Whitmore Holdings, the foundation, and the growing number of community projects inspired by the center's success. On the surface, nothing had changed. Yet, something quietly had. Their friendship had become part of the rhythm of everyday life. Some weeks they met during advisory meetings. Other times they exchanged a thoughtful article about parenting, leadership, or emotional well-being. Occasionally, Adrian would stop by the hospital cafe, and if Jasmine happened to have a few free minutes, they would share coffee before returning to their responsibilities. There was no pressure, no expectations, just consistency. And consistency, Jasmine had learned, was one of the clearest languages of trust. One Friday afternoon, Jasmine found herself laughing at something Caleb had said while waiting outside his preschool classroom. "Mama," he whispered loudly, "I think Miss Sarah likes dinosaurs." Jasmine smiled. "What makes you think that?" "She wears dinosaur socks." She laughed. "I suppose that's a reasonable conclusion." Just then, another parent approached. "Excuse me?" Jasmine turned politely. The woman smiled. "I've seen you here a few times." "I'm Rachel." "Jasmine." Rachel glanced toward Caleb. "Our boys are always playing together." Jasmine smiled. "They seem to get along." Rachel hesitated before asking, "Would you and Caleb like to join us for a picnic tomorrow?" Jasmine almost declined out of habit. For years, she had avoided accepting invitations from people she barely knew. It felt easier to stay inside the small circle she trusted. Then she remembered something Patricia once told her. Healing isn't only learning how to protect your heart, it's also learning when it's safe to open it. She smiled warmly. "We'd love to." Rachel beamed. "Wonderful." As she walked away, Jasmine realized something. A few years ago, loneliness had become so familiar that she mistook isolation for peace. Now, she was slowly remembering how healthy community felt. Meanwhile, Adrian sat in Daniel Reynolds' office reviewing plans for another community partnership. Daniel closed the file in front of him. "We're finished." Adrian nodded. "Good." Daniel looked at him for a long moment. "What?" "I've been waiting for you to say something." "About what?" Daniel leaned back in his chair. "Jasmine." Adrian laughed. "You really don't give up." "I've known you 20 years. Daniel smiled. "You've never spent this much time with someone without eventually deciding what you wanted." Adrian looked thoughtful. "I know what I want." Daniel waited. "I want whatever protects her peace." Daniel smiled. "I believe you. But what if protecting her peace also means being honest about your feelings?" The room became quiet. Adrian stared at the city skyline outside the office window. He had avoided asking himself that question, not because he feared the answer, because he feared the timing. Jasmine had worked hard to rebuild a life rooted in stability. He refused to become another source of pressure. Daniel finally spoke. "There's a difference between rushing someone and trusting them with the truth." Adrian remained silent. The thought stayed with him long after he left the office. Saturday's picnic took place at Piedmont Park. Children ran through open fields while parents gathered beneath large oak trees sharing homemade food. Caleb and Rachel's son disappeared almost immediately in search of squirrels. Jasmine laughed as she watched them. Rachel handed her a glass of lemonade. "You seem happy." Jasmine smiled. "I think I am." "I wasn't sure at first." "What do you mean?" Rachel looked slightly embarrassed. "The first few times I saw you, you always looked like someone carrying something heavy." Jasmine nodded thoughtfully. "I probably was." "And now?" She watched Caleb helping another little girl fly a kite. "I've learned I don't have to carry everything by myself." Rachel smiled warmly. "That's a difficult lesson. It took me longer than I'd like to admit." Nearby, two mothers began discussing the Family Resource Center. "I heard it's wonderful." "It really is. They even have parenting support groups." Jasmine listened quietly as strangers praised something she had helped create. She didn't interrupt. She didn't mention her involvement. Instead, She simply smiled. There is a quiet joy in watching something you've contributed to help people who will never know your name. That evening, Adrian received a text message from Jasmine. Thank you for creating a place where so many families feel supported. Today, I heard complete strangers talking about the center. They had no idea who helped build it. Somehow, that made me smile. He read the message twice before replying. It was never my center. It belongs to everyone who believed families deserved better. Thank you for helping us imagine what that could look like. A few minutes later, another message appeared. Can I ask you something? He smiled. Always. The typing bubble appeared, disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, her message arrived. Do you ever worry that happiness makes you forget the difficult parts of your life? Adrian stared at the question. It wasn't one he had expected. He thought carefully before answering. No. I think healthy happiness changes how we remember difficult seasons. It doesn't erase them. It reminds us they weren't the whole story. Several minutes passed. Then Jasmine replied, I think I needed to hear that tonight. Thank you. Adrian placed the phone down. He realized she hadn't texted because she needed advice. She had texted because she trusted him with a question that lived close to her heart. That realization meant more than he could explain. The following Tuesday, Brandon met Jasmine at the park for another visit with Caleb. This time, Caleb greeted him more comfortably. Hi. Brandon smiled broadly. Hi, buddy. The three of them spent the afternoon feeding ducks by the lake. As Caleb chased birds across the grass, Brandon turned toward Jasmine. I've been thinking. She smiled faintly. That can be dangerous. He laughed. I deserve that. Then his expression became serious. I owe you something. What? He took a slow breath. I've been hoping we'd eventually become a family again. Jasmine remained quiet. But... He looked toward Caleb. I've realized that's not what this should be about. She listened carefully. It should be about becoming the father Caleb deserves. He smiled sadly. Not the boyfriend I failed to be. Jasmine felt genuine respect rise within her. Not because he had changed overnight. People rarely do. But because he was finally separating his own desires from Caleb's needs. That mattered. You've grown, she said quietly. I hope so. No. She smiled. I think you have. Sometimes growth is revealed not by what people pursue, but by what they stop expecting. As the afternoon drew to a close, Jasmine drove home with an unexpected sense of peace. The past no longer felt like an unfinished conversation. It felt like a completed chapter. And for the first time, she found herself wondering what the next chapter might hold. She just didn't realize someone else had been asking himself the very same question. The first Saturday of November arrived wrapped in cool air and bright sunshine. Atlanta's parks were filled with families taking advantage of the last warm weekend before winter settled in. Jasmine and Caleb spent the morning decorating their apartment for Thanksgiving. Paper leaves covered the dining table. Construction paper turkeys, most of them lopsided thanks to Caleb's enthusiastic use of glue, were scattered across the living room floor. Mama! Caleb held up a leaf covered with uneven handwriting. I wrote something. Jasmine smiled. You did? He nodded proudly. It says... He sounded out each letter slowly. Thankful. She kissed the top of his head. I'm very proud of you. He looked at her expectantly. What are you thankful for? The question seemed simple. Yet Jasmine didn't answer immediately. A year ago, she would have listed things she hoped to have someday. A complete family. Certainty. A future that looked exactly the way she once imagined. Now, her answer felt different. I'm thankful for people who stay. Caleb nodded, as though the answer made perfect sense. I'm thankful for pancakes. Jasmine laughed. I think that's an excellent answer too. Children had a remarkable way of reminding adults that gratitude didn't always need to be complicated. Later that afternoon, Adrian visited the Family Resource Center without announcing his arrival. He preferred seeing the building during ordinary weekends rather than scheduled tours. Inside, the center was alive with quiet activity. A support group met in one room. A volunteer read picture books to children in another. New parents shared coffee while their babies slept peacefully in strollers. No one seemed particularly aware that the founder of the foundation was walking through the hallway. Adrian liked it that way. He paused outside one of the counseling rooms. Through the glass, he noticed a whiteboard covered with handwritten responses to a weekly reflection exercise. The question written at the top caught his attention. What helped you feel less alone this week? The answers were simple. A neighbor who brought dinner. My husband stayed awake with the baby so I could sleep. A stranger smiled at me when I was crying. The nurse who remembered my name. Someone listened without trying to fix me. Adrian stood there for several minutes. Every answer pointed toward the same truth. People remembered how they were treated long after they forgot exactly what had been said. He quietly smiled. The center was doing exactly what it had been created to do. That evening, Jasmine received an invitation from Adrian. Not to dinner. Not to anything elaborate. Just a message. The community library is hosting a children's reading event tomorrow afternoon. I promised to volunteer for an hour. If you and Caleb don't already have plans, you'd both be very welcome. No pressure. She smiled. The invitation felt like Adrian. Thoughtful, simple, free from expectation. The next afternoon, Caleb immediately became fascinated by a puppet show while Adrian read picture books to a small circle of children. Jasmine stood quietly near the back of the room, watching. She had never seen him around so many children before. He wasn't trying to entertain them. He simply treated every question as though it mattered. One little boy interrupted the story halfway through. "My dinosaur doesn't like vegetables." The other children burst into laughter. Instead of correcting him, Adrian smiled. "That's a serious challenge." The little boy nodded solemnly. "What should I do?" Adrian pretended to think. "I recommend negotiating." The children laughed again. Jasmine found herself laughing too. There was something deeply attractive about kindness that expected nothing in return. Not dramatic kindness. Ordinary kindness. The kind practiced when no one important seemed to be watching. After the event ended, the three of them walked slowly toward the parking lot. Caleb skipped a few steps ahead, proudly carrying the book Adrian had helped him choose. "I like him," Caleb announced. Jasmine smiled. "I'm glad. He listens." She looked at her son. "What makes you say that?" "When I talk." Caleb shrugged. "He doesn't hurry me." Jasmine stopped walking for the briefest moment. Children notice things adults often overlooked. Respect, patience, attention. Those qualities couldn't be hidden, nor could they be faked for very long. She caught up with Adrian. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." "Caleb likes you." Adrian smiled. "I like him too." They continued walking. Then Jasmine added quietly, "He said you listen." Adrian looked thoughtful. "I think children deserve the same attention adults hope to receive." She nodded. "I agree." Neither realized how much that small conversation would stay with Jasmine. A few days later, Patricia invited Adrian to Thanksgiving dinner, not as Jasmine's date, simply as someone who had become an important part of their lives. When Jasmine learned about the invitation, she looked surprised. "You invited him?" Patricia smiled innocently. "I did. You should have asked me." "I know." Her aunt poured herself another cup of tea. "I wanted to ask myself something first." "And what was that? Does he make this family feel more peaceful when he's around?" Jasmine smiled despite herself. "Yes." "Then I didn't need another reason." She laughed softly. "You really like him?" Patricia looked directly at her. "I like the woman you become when you're around him." The room grew quiet. Jasmine looked away. "What do you mean?" "You don't second-guess yourself. You don't shrink. You don't spend the whole conversation trying to earn approval." Patricia smiled gently. "You simply relax." She reached across the table. "My dear, never underestimate the value of relationships that allow you to become more of yourself." Those words echoed in Jasmine's heart long after the conversation ended. Thanksgiving arrived with clear skies and crisp autumn air. The house filled with laughter, the smell of roasted turkey, sweet potatoes and fresh cornbread. Caleb insisted on helping set the table, although his version of helping resulted in forks being placed where spoons belonged. Patricia quietly fixed everything after he wandered away. When Adrian arrived carrying a homemade apple pie prepared by his mother, Patricia welcomed him with a warm embrace. "My mother insisted I bring this." "Then tell her she's already invited next year." Everyone laughed. Throughout the afternoon, Jasmine found herself watching small moments rather than big ones. Adrian helping Caleb assemble a toy train without taking over, listening attentively as Patricia shared stories about Jasmine's childhood, offering to wash dishes before anyone asked. He never performed kindness. He simply lived it. At one point, Patricia quietly leaned toward Jasmine. "Notice something?" Jasmine followed her aunt's gaze. Adrian was kneeling on the living room floor, while Caleb enthusiastically explained why dinosaurs would make terrible school teachers. Adrian listened with complete seriousness. "What?" Patricia smiled. "He doesn't love people by impressing them. He loves people by making them feel important." Jasmine swallowed softly. She realized Patricia was right. For months, she had been comparing Adrian to Brandon without meaning to. Today, for the first time, she stopped comparing, because she finally understood something. Healthy love shouldn't be measured against past disappointment. It should be recognized on its own character. That evening, after Adrian said goodbye and drove home, Jasmine stood quietly on the porch, watching the taillights disappear down the street. Patricia stepped beside her. "You've been quiet." Jasmine smiled. "I've been thinking." Her aunt laughed. "I wonder where you learned that." Jasmine looked up at the stars. "I don't think I'm afraid anymore." "Of what?" She took a slow breath. "Of believing that someone might actually stay." Inside the house, Caleb called for his mother. Jasmine smiled and turned toward the sound. As she walked back inside, she didn't notice Patricia smiling to herself. Because, sometimes, the most important love stories don't begin the day two people meet. They begin the day fear quietly loses its hold on one of their hearts. Winter arrived gently. Atlanta rarely saw heavy snow, but the December mornings carried a crispness that invited people to slow down. Coffee stayed warm a little longer in grateful hands. Scarves appeared. Neighborhoods glowed with soft white lights, and children counted the days until Christmas with a kind of excitement adults secretly missed. Jasmine stood outside her apartment one chilly morning, helping Caleb zip up his little blue coat. "You look very handsome." He grinned. "I know." She laughed. "Confidence already?" "I'm 4. As if that explains everything. "It does." He nodded with complete certainty. Jasmine smiled as she lifted him into his car seat. There was a time when mornings like this felt rushed. Now she tried to notice them. The laughter, the small conversations, the ordinary miracles hidden inside familiar routines. She had learned that a meaningful life wasn't built only through extraordinary days. It was built by paying attention to ordinary ones. The Family Resource Center had become one of the busiest places in the hospital. Support groups were full. Volunteer applications continued arriving every week. The reading room had become a favorite gathering place for parents waiting between appointments. No one referred to it as the new center anymore. It had simply become part of the community. Jasmine often walked through the building during her lunch break, not to inspect it, to enjoy it. One afternoon, she noticed something that stopped her in her tracks. Near the entrance hung a large bulletin board titled, "Moments That Gave Me Hope." Dozens of handwritten cards covered the board. Some were only a sentence long. Others filled entire pages. She slowly began reading. "I came here believing I was failing as a mother. I left believing I could learn. Someone remembered my name after my second visit. That mattered more than they probably know. This was the first place where I didn't feel embarrassed to admit I was overwhelmed. My husband and I learned how to talk to each other again." I smiled for the first time in weeks. Jasmine felt emotion rise quietly inside her. None of the cards mentioned money. None praised beautiful furniture. None discussed impressive architecture. Every message spoke about people, about kindness, about being heard. She smiled. Perhaps buildings never changed lives. People did. Buildings simply gave them a place to meet. That same afternoon, Adrian arrived for a routine board meeting. Before entering the conference room, he stopped at the bulletin board. He read the same notes Jasmine had read only an hour earlier. Neither of them knew the other had been there. He reached the final card near the bottom. It read, "Thank you for teaching me that asking for help isn't the end of strength. It's the beginning of healing." Adrian quietly closed his eyes. Months earlier, he had hoped the center might help families. Now strangers were explaining exactly how it had. He didn't need another measure of success. This was enough. The annual hospital holiday gathering took place the following Friday evening. Unlike formal charity galas, this celebration belonged entirely to hospital staff, volunteers, patients and their families. Children decorated cookies. A local choir performed Christmas songs. Retired nurses reunited with former co-workers. Doctors arrived wearing sweaters instead of white coats. For one evening, titles disappeared. Everyone simply belonged. Patricia convinced Jasmine to attend. "You spend enough time taking care of everyone else." She smiled. "Tonight, let people take care of you." Jasmine laughed. "I don't know if anyone's planning to take care of me." "They will." Her aunt replied confidently. "You finally allowed yourself to become part of a community." The event was already underway when Jasmine arrived with Caleb. Within minutes, Caleb had disappeared into a group of children decorating gingerbread houses. Emily waved enthusiastically from across the room. "There you are." "I thought we were late." "We're nurses." Emily laughed. "We're always either early or late." As they talked, Adrian entered through the opposite doorway. He wore a simple charcoal sweater instead of a suit. For a moment, Jasmine barely recognized him. Then he smiled. The same calm smile she had come to know over the past year. He walked over. "I'm glad you came." "So am I." She looked at him playfully. "You clean up well outside the boardroom." He laughed. "My mother insisted I leave the tie at home. She made the right decision. I'll let her know you approved." Their conversation flowed as naturally as it always had. Neither searched for topics. Neither worried about awkward pauses. Months of friendship had quietly removed that pressure. Later in the evening, the hospital director invited several people to share brief reflections about the past year. Karen spoke first, then a volunteer, then one of the counselors. Finally, Karen surprised everyone. "Jasmine." She smiled toward the audience. "Would you mind saying a few words?" Jasmine looked genuinely startled. "I wasn't prepared." Karen smiled warmly. "The truth usually doesn't require much preparation." Laughter filled the room. Jasmine slowly walked to the front. She looked around at the familiar faces. Doctors, custodians, receptionists, parents, volunteers, friends. She took one slow breath. "When this year began, I believed my life would always be divided into two parts." She paused. "The life before I was abandoned. And the life after." The room became very still. But something unexpected happened. She smiled gently. "I met people who refused to let that become the only story they knew about me." She looked toward the nurses. They saw a colleague. Toward the volunteers. A teammate. Toward Patricia. A daughter. Toward Caleb. A mother. Finally, her eyes rested briefly on Adrian. "And some people?" She smiled softly. "Simply reminded me that consistency is one of the greatest expressions of love." Silence settled over the room. Not uncomfortable silence. Thoughtful silence. Jasmine continued. "I've learned something this year. We often ask whether difficult seasons change people." She nodded slowly. "They do. But kindness changes people too. And I'm standing here tonight because enough people chose kindness." When she finished, the applause lasted much longer than she expected. Not because her speech was dramatic, because it was deeply true. As everyone returned to their tables, Adrian stepped outside for a few moments to breathe the cool evening air. A light breeze carried the scent of pine from the holiday decorations lining the courtyard. A few minutes later, Jasmine joined him. "I escaped." He smiled. "So did I." She leaned against the railing. "I don't really enjoy being the center of attention." "I noticed." She laughed. "You probably also noticed my hands shaking." "I did." "You looked calm." "I wasn't." She turned toward him. "You weren't?" "No." He smiled. "I just had more practice pretending." She laughed warmly. "That's comforting." They stood quietly beneath strings of white lights. Finally, Adrian spoke. "You said something tonight that stayed with me." "What was that?" "Consistency is one of the greatest expressions of love." She nodded. "I believe that." "So do I." He looked out across the courtyard before continuing. "I've realized that love isn't usually revealed during extraordinary moments." He smiled gently. "It's revealed on ordinary Tuesdays. When someone remembers how you take your coffee. When they ask how your day really went. When they keep showing up, long after the exciting parts are over." Jasmine looked at him thoughtfully. "I couldn't agree more." Neither realized it then, but both had unknowingly described the relationship they had already built. Without grand declarations, without rushing, without even naming it. They had slowly become the steady presence each had once believed was impossible to find. And before Christmas arrived, one final conversation would ask them whether they were ready to acknowledge what their hearts had. Christmas Eve arrived wrapped in quiet snowfall. Atlanta rarely received snow before the holidays, but that year delicate white flakes drifted gently from the sky, settling on rooftops, sidewalks, and bare tree branches. Caleb stood at the apartment window with his nose pressed against the glass. "Mama, it's snowing!" Jasmine walked beside him and smiled. "It certainly is." He looked up with wide eyes. "Do you think Santa can still find us?" She laughed softly. "I think he'll have an even easier time." "Why?" "Because the snow makes everything brighter." Caleb nodded thoughtfully, apparently satisfied with the explanation. Children had a wonderful habit of accepting hope without demanding proof. Jasmine wished more adults remembered how to do that. Later that morning, she and Caleb drove to Patricia's house to help prepare Christmas dinner. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon, roasted turkey, and fresh bread. Christmas music played softly through an old radio that Patricia refused to replace. "It still works," she always insisted. "So why buy another one?" As they cooked together, Patricia looked toward Jasmine. "You seem peaceful." "I am." She smiled while stirring a pot of cranberry sauce. "I used to think peace meant having all the answers. And now? I think peace means trusting that I can handle whatever answers eventually come." Patricia smiled proudly. "Your mother would have loved hearing you say that." Jasmine looked down for a moment. "I hope so. I know so." Across town, Adrian finished helping his mother deliver holiday meals to several elderly neighbors. Margaret closed the trunk of her car and smiled. "You've been distracted all morning." He laughed. "Am I really that obvious?" "Only to people who've loved you your entire life." She linked her arm through his as they walked back toward the house. "Tell me." He hesitated. "I've been thinking about Jasmine." Margaret nodded. "I imagined as much. I don't want to rush her. I know. I don't want to make her feel pressured." "I know," he smiled. "I also don't want fear to become another way of avoiding honesty." His mother stopped walking. She turned to face him fully. "Adrian, the healthiest relationships aren't built by pretending feelings don't exist." She smiled gently. "They're built by trusting another person with the truth, while giving them complete freedom in how they respond." He took a slow breath. "I think I'm ready. I think you are too." That evening, Patricia's house filled with familiar laughter. Emily arrived with homemade cookies. Sophia stopped by after visiting her parents. Daniel came carrying enough desserts to feed twice the number of guests. Margaret joined them shortly afterward. When Adrian entered a few minutes later, Caleb ran straight toward him. "You came!" "I promised I would." Caleb took his hand. "Come see my train." Without hesitation, Adrian followed him into the living room. Jasmine watched from the kitchen doorway. Patricia quietly stepped beside her. "You see it now?" "What?" "The difference." Jasmine looked at her aunt. "What difference?" "Brandon loved you with promises." She spoke gently, without bitterness. "Adrian loves people with presence." Jasmine looked toward the living room. Adrian was sitting cross-legged on the floor, while Caleb carefully explained the complicated route his toy train had to travel. He wasn't checking his phone. He wasn't pretending to listen. He was completely present. Patricia smiled softly. "One day, I hope you choose the person who makes peace feel ordinary." Those words settled deeply inside Jasmine's heart. After dinner, everyone gathered outside to watch the neighborhood Christmas lights. Snow continued falling lightly. Children laughed as they tried catching snowflakes on their tongues. Inside the warmth of the porch, Jasmine found Adrian standing quietly with 2 cups of hot chocolate. "I thought you might want one." She accepted it gratefully. "You remembered." "I remember most things involving coffee or chocolate." She laughed. "I've noticed." For a while, they simply watched the snow. Then Adrian spoke. "I've been thinking about something." She smiled. "I know someone else who says that a lot." He laughed. "I'll take that as a compliment." "It is." He grew thoughtful. "When we first met, I thought I was helping a stranger." She looked at him. "I was wrong." "How?" "You ended up helping me just as much." She frowned slightly. "I don't think I did." "You did." He smiled. "You reminded me that success isn't measured only by what we build. It's measured by who we become while building it." She looked down at the steam rising from her cup. "That's kind of you to say." "It's true." Silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, Adrian took one slow breath. "Jasmine, I don't want to change the friendship we've built." "Neither do I." He nodded. "That's exactly why I need to be honest." Her heart beat a little faster. He continued calmly. "I've come to care about you very deeply." He smiled gently. "Not because I think you need someone to rescue you." "You don't." "Not because I think you're incomplete." "You aren't." He looked directly into her eyes. "I care about you because I admire the woman you've become. The mother you are. The kindness you offer. The integrity you live by." He paused. "And because every ordinary day seems a little brighter when I know you'll be part of it." Jasmine felt tears gather quietly in her eyes, not from surprise. Some part of her heart had sensed this conversation was coming. He continued before she could speak. "I don't need an answer tonight. I don't want you to feel any pressure. If friendship is all you ever want, I'll be grateful for that." He smiled warmly. "I simply didn't want fear to keep me from telling you the truth." The snow fell silently around them. Jasmine looked at him for a long moment. Then she smiled. "You know what I've been afraid of?" He waited. "I've been afraid that loving someone again meant forgetting everything I learned." She shook her head gently. "But I've realized something." "What?" "Loving you wouldn't require me to become the woman I used to be." She stepped a little closer. "Because you fell in love with the woman I became." Emotion softened Adrian's expression. Jasmine continued. "I don't need someone to complete my life." She smiled through happy tears. "I'd simply like to share it." For a brief moment, neither of them moved. Then Adrian reached out, slowly, not to pull her toward him, simply offering his hand. She placed hers in it. No dramatic embrace, no hurried kiss. Just two hands meeting with complete certainty. Because love built on respect doesn't rush. It recognizes. Across the yard, Caleb looked up from building a tiny snowman with Daniel. "Mama!" He pointed excitedly. "You and Adrian are holding hands." Everyone turned. Patricia smiled knowingly. Margaret laughed softly. Emily clapped once before covering her mouth. Jasmine laughed through her tears. "Yes." She looked down at Caleb. "We are." Caleb grinned. "I knew it." The adults burst into laughter. 6 months later, the Family Resource Center celebrated its first anniversary. More than 3,000 families had received support. Hundreds of volunteers had donated their time. Several hospitals across Georgia had begun creating similar programs inspired by its success. Near the entrance, a new plaque had been installed. It read, "Communities grow stronger when ordinary people choose extraordinary kindness." Jasmine stood beside Adrian, Caleb between them, as families filled the courtyard once again. Brandon attended too, not as someone trying to reclaim the past, but as a father steadily rebuilding trust with his son, one visit, one promise kept, one ordinary afternoon at a time. He smiled warmly at Jasmine and Adrian before joining Caleb for a game of catch. Forgiveness had not erased consequences, but it had created space for healthier futures. Jasmine watched the people around her. Parents laughing, children running, volunteers welcoming newcomers, friends embracing. Then she looked at Adrian. "Do you remember the first day we met?" He smiled. "The runaway balloon?" She laughed. "I thought that was the worst day of my life." He gently squeezed her hand. "And now?" She looked around the center filled with hope. "I think it was the day my life quietly began again." Adrian smiled. "Sometimes." The people who change our future don't arrive with grand speeches. They simply stay. Jasmine nodded. "And sometimes." The greatest love stories aren't about being rescued. She looked at Caleb, laughing with Brandon in the distance, before returning her gaze to Adrian. They're about becoming the kind of people who know how to love well. They stood together as the afternoon sun filled the courtyard with warm light. Not because life had become perfect. It hadn't. There would still be difficult days, unexpected disappointments, moments requiring patience, forgiveness, and courage. But they had learned the lesson that mattered most. Love is not proven by the promises people make when life is easy. It is revealed by the quiet consistency of those who choose to stay, to listen, to respect, and to grow alongside one another. And in the end, that was the kind of love worth waiting for. What a beautiful journey we've shared together. Jasmine's story reminds us that real love isn't found in grand promises or perfect moments. It's found in the people who stay when life becomes difficult, who respect our boundaries, encourage our growth, and choose us again and again through their actions. In the end, Jasmine wasn't rescued by a billionaire. She was transformed by healing, self-respect, forgiveness, and the courage to believe that healthy love is something to be earned, not chased. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable love story filled with hope, powerful life lessons, and inspiring endings. Now we'd love to hear from you. What was the biggest lesson you learned from Jasmine and Adrian's journey? Do you believe true love is proven by words, or by the quiet consistency of someone who chooses to stay? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story or perspective could encourage someone who needs hope today. Thank you for spending your time with us. Until our next story, remember this. The strongest relationships are not built by perfection. They are built by trust, respect, patience, and the everyday choice to love well.